Well, hello dear comrades, and welcome to this new episode where we continue our close reading of Slow Down by Kōhei Saitō. Last week we went through the second chapter of the book about green Keynesianism. We've seen that the root cause of climate change is economic growth, and thus all attempts to combat climate change while maintaining growth are bound to fail. The only way then is to opt for degrowth, but what kind of degrowth are we talking about here? Because, well, we have to be a little bit skeptical because not all degrowth is actually degrowth. But before we talk about that, Saito needs to stress something important, and that is, if we agree that the northern countries are the ones mostly responsible for carbon emissions, and therefore they should abandon growth, well, does it mean that the South should do the same thing? The intuitive response to this would be no. After all, like Saito says, there are many people in the world right now who lack access to electricity or potable water, to education or even sufficient food, and these people are mostly in the global south, in the least developed countries in the world. So it is only natural for them to consider economic development as their only way out of misery and poverty, and thus to solve the north-south divide. Saito says that he'd never deny the benevolence and importance of these efforts, and one can argue that maybe it's only one side of the globe who needs to slow down its economic growth. But this, however, doesn't make any sense, for as we've seen, to seek economic growth in whatever aspect of economic growth, that is going to be detrimental to the climate. Even if we reverse the trend and allow southern countries to develop economically and slow economic growth in the north, well, the earth is already at its limits, and so the economic development in the south, even if it's going to be less brutal than the north's, we suppose, it is still going to cause a trespass of other planetary boundaries. For a reminder, a planetary boundary is a tipping point that if we cross, it's going to have irreversible consequences on life on Earth. We've established that there are 9 boundaries, and we have already breached 4. So the Earth cannot afford more emissions, and so development models with economic growth as their focus are reaching an impasse. Like Saito says, their popularity is declining, and criticism of the World Bank and the IMF are growing. He gives at note 54 2 sources for such criticisms, because of course, if the popularity of economic growth models is declining, well, it's only natural that the criticism of the institutions that promote them will grow. So the first critique is Jason Hickel's book, The Divide, a brief guide to global inequality and its solutions. And so in this book, Hickel goes against the myth promoted by the World Bank and the IMF, which is that global inequality is the result of poor countries failing to catch up with rich countries due to internal shortcomings like bad governance, corruption, or lack of innovation. When you frame the problem that way, it's obvious that its solution is going to be economic growth. Hickel's assertion is that the construction of this narrative that global inequality is just a lack of economic growth, it serves the ideological plan of the North to spread its influence on the rest of the world. It wants southern countries to follow capitalism so that it can keep exploiting them. As Hickel shows, this narrative, it came during Harry Truman's 1949 inaugural address, where the concept of underdevelopment was coined. 1949 was the beginning of the Cold War, and so fearing that the Third War follows the communist bloc, this concept was coined to justify Western dominance under the guise of aid and progress. The West basically tells you, don't follow the Soviets, your problem is that you are underdeveloped, and the only way out is by economic growth as we understand it, of course. So I can help you grow, just let me intervene once in a while in your affairs, and you will see that in no time you'll be competing with me as equals in the global market. So Hickel argues that it isn't underdevelopment that is the cause of global inequality. As a matter of fact, he says that in the 1500s, so 500 years ago, there was little difference in living standards between Europe and the rest of the world. But it was through colonial plunder, slavery, and land disposition that the global north enriched itself at the expense of the south. Global inequality is the outcome of a long history of exploitation, colonization, and deliberate economic manipulation by the global north, and it continues today under new forms of economic imperialism, maintained through debt, trade imbalances, unequal exchange, corporate extraction, and global financial rules. And so this pattern persisted even after decolonization through tools like structural adjustment programs. They are imposed by the IMF and the World Bank, which dismantled state welfare and economic sovereignty in the South during the 1980s and the 1990s. The other criticism is from Herman E. Daly, Beyond Growth, the Economics of Sustainable Development, and it challenged economic growth by saying that economic growth, well, doesn't respect the larger system's limits and capacities, the system of which it is a subsystem. Economic growth is bad because of its dialectical relationship with the environment. That is the larger system. Now, the environment is the larger system, and so it is, the ecosystem is a larger system. And he argues that economy is just a subsystem of the ecosystem. That means that economy as a subsystem, it depends on the ecosystem as a source of raw material, material inputs, and as a sink for waste outputs. The ecosystem regenerates the raw materials, the inputs, and absorbs waste, which is the outputs. But these processes take time, and as such, economic activities, the activities that take the inputs and release the outputs, they must be kept at ecologically sustainable levels as a condition of sustainable development. And with this in mind, he argues that models that are growth-oriented, they are useless because they don't respect those levels, and hence we need to replace the economic norm of quantitative expansion, meaning growth, with qualitative improvement, which is here development. He calls it development, but it's very different from development in the sense of, we are talking about economic growth as development. So he proposes this. He suggests that we replace the economic norm of quantitative expansion, growth, with qualitative improvement, meaning development, as the path for future progress. And so this would be true sustainable development, and he says that we shouldn't talk about economic growth anymore if we want to talk about sustainable development. Like the two are mutually exclusive. You cannot talk about sustainable development if you mean by development economic growth. But economic development here instead seeks improvement. We are talking about improvement in people's lives, not quantitative expansion. So his criticism towards the World Bank, which is on page 5, all of this is in the introduction of the book. His criticism is that the World Bank doesn't see this relationship between the two systems, between the subsystem and the ecosystem. And because of that, despite its constant promotion of sustainable development, the term remains extremely vague and abstract and basically means growth. So it simply appeals to some values, like, for example, respect for future generations, but concretely the sub-ecosystem relation is completely absent. And the reason why it's that its approach to problems, the World Bank's approach to problems, is analytical instead of dialectic. An analytical approach would be trying, for example, to solve economic problems within the economy without seeing that it overlaps with other notions and concepts, like, for example, democracy, justice, welfare. These are dialectic notions which require that they all be taken together at once. We cannot, for example, understand democracy without also, understanding justice or, relating it to justice. And we cannot understand justice without welfare, etc. So these concepts have evolving penumbras, as Daly says, which partially overlap with other concepts. There is, for example, an age at which we are both young and old, so youth and old, you know, they overlap. A tidal salt marsh is both land and sea. A credit card is both money and non-money. So these are the examples that Daly gives to illustrate what he's trying to say. When we apply this to economics, we'll immediately see that growth models are inadequate in that they don't take into consideration these other concepts like ecological concepts, social or political concepts with which, you know, economics overlap. If they did, they'll draw the similar conclusion of the classical economists like John Stuart Mill, who said that growth cannot keep going on indefinitely because no one should seek growth for its own sake, but for something else. The point of growth is to allow us to arrive at a state where we don't need growth anymore. The reason why we want growth is to secure the conditions for freedom, so that we don't ever have to worry about food, water, diseases, and so we can focus on, in Mill's words, and this is how Mill frames it, he says that we need to get to a point at which we can only focus on improving the art of living when minds cease to be engrossed by the art of getting on. So replacing the art of getting on. The art of getting on is when you worry about food, water, or, you know, diseases, etc. You replace the art of getting on with the art of living. Like now we just worry about the quality of our life, like how to improve the quality of our life instead of, you know, just running after food, water, and basic stuff. However, this isn't what the World Bank has in mind. Its solution in a report that Daly read in 1992 entitled The Development and the Environment. He didn't work on it directly, but he commented on its drafts. So the solution proposed in that report by the World Bank is, of course, it's just that, it's more growth. When faced with the public health consequences of the environmental degradation of water and air, the World Bank explained that it explained that as a consequence of, you know, poverty, and the solution proposed was the same as the World Bank's solutions to other economic problems, namely more growth. And this meant not only growth in the south, but also in the north. It wasn't like, okay, the north has enough growth and it must, you know, stop because too much emissions already, so let's just, you know, let's just let the south develop too, economically speaking, and like economic growth. No, they went for, if the south needs to economically grow, then the north must grow too. For how else can the south grow if it cannot, if it could not export to northern markets and receive foreign investments from the north? And how could the north provide these foreign investment and larger markets for the south if in turn it did not grow? So Daly is an academic who worked for a time at the World Bank from 1988 to 1994. And he says that the reason why he left the World Bank was because of the policies it promoted regarding climate change. So he returned to academia, hoping that there he'll find people who respect truth and honesty. But of course, he was disappointed because it turns out, like the World Bank is still dedicated to expanding the boundary by economic growth. Academic economists are even more dedicated to economic growth, and of course the US government is yet even more committed to growth as a goal. At this point, Saito returns to Kate Raworth, the political economist who tackled the problem of the North-South divide for many years, and the NGO Oxfam. It's an NGO that aids the development internationally. We already mentioned her in the previous chapter. So after working for Oxfam for many years and promoting international economic development plans and SDGs, she soon realized the inefficiency of such measures, and so she began criticizing mainstream economics and supporting degrowth. So what caused this change of heart? Well, this is where we turn to the most influential and important concept that Raworth developed, which is Doughnut economics. So, Doughnut economics, it's a concept that serves as a compass in order to know the limits of our economic activities. It tries to answer the following question: how much economic development can occur that will allow all of humanity to thrive while respecting the planet's ecological limits? So, let's look at this diagram of Doughnut economics. It is based on Raworth's book, 2017 book, Doughnut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. So, this is Doughnut economics. You have an economic model shaped like a donut. The circle of the donut is composed of 3 layers or 3 circles: an inner circle, a middle circle, and an outer circle. The most important circle is the one in the middle. That circle represents the safe and just space for humanity. This is where human beings can live and thrive within certain limits. To maintain the respect of these limits, we require a regenerative and distributive economy. In other words, it's that kind of economics that will keep humanity in that safe space. So that safe space, like I said, is between 2 limits represented by the inner and outer circle. The inner circle is called the social foundation. It represents the basics or the material conditions for that safe space for human thriving and flourishing, to realize their full potential, to live well, etc. So she identifies 12 elements that are required in someone's life to say that their life is flourishing or thriving. People need access to food, water, energy, networks, housing, gender equality, social equity, political voice, peace and justice, income and work, education, and health. Living while these 12 elements are lacking is the situation in which many people find themselves today in the global south. The traditional argument says that in order for those people to have access to that social foundation so that they can move to the middle circle of the donut, they need economic growth. Only it will allow that access. However, that economic growth needs to be sustainable. The point of realizing humanity's full potential isn't to allow everyone to behave in any manner they wish, but to make sure that they do so without exceeding a certain limit. And that limit isn't a moral limit, but an ecological limit. It's about the impact of that manner, that way of life on the environment. This is where we get to the outer circle of the donut, the ecological ceiling. If you transgress that ceiling, you will lose sustainability. And in a non-sustainable environment and economics, those social foundations get destroyed, and so we lose our chance to thrive. The ecological ceiling is composed of the 9 planetary boundaries identified by Rockstrom that we've seen last time. They are climate change, ozone layer depletion, air pollution, biodiversity loss, land conversion, freshwater withdrawals, nitrogen and phosphorus loading, chemical pollution, and ocean acidification. So, this is pretty simple to grasp. We need an economic system that sustains that balance, that keeps us between those 2 circles, between the inner and the outer circle. And so such system would be called sustainable. And of course, it needs to be a global economic system. It doesn't make sense to have some regions having a system that destroys the environment while others don't. It's obvious that an economic system of the kind that we have right now will try to extend, since it only works by exhausting resources. Once it exhausts the resources nearby, it will try to extract the resources of neighboring regions, etc. And like we've seen, that kind of economic system, since it relies on the exhaustion of resources and of the periphery, it automatically leads to an unequal access to use of resources, hence the inequalities and discriminations between its members, whether based on gender, ethnicity, religious beliefs, political opinion, etc. Like Saito says, however, as we've seen again and again thus far, those of us living in the developed countries do so in a way that already grossly overruns multiple planetary boundaries, while at the same time, many of those in the global south live at a level below Raworth's definition of the minimum social foundation. The present system is not only hugely destructive to the environment, but profoundly unjust as well. So, the entire world being responsible for climate change since globalization, needs to move to a sustainable economic system that Raworth calls regenerative and distributive economy. Only then will allow as many people as possible to thrive in the space between the upper and lower circles. Now, we need to turn to some inconvenient truth about the current economic model. I already said that the economic model that we have now, the capitalist system, growth-oriented, ultimately leads to an overshoot of planetary boundaries. But at the same time, for many, it has proven itself to be efficient in securing the social foundations for many people. It has even been suggested that this economic model, that overshoots the ecological ceiling, is also the only way for nations to secure, at least for a while, the social foundations for most of its members. Saito mentions an empirical 2018 study led by British environmental economist Daniel O'Neill, A Good Life for All Within Planetary Boundaries, that points in this direction. He went through 150 countries to see how well each fit within the inner and outer rings of Raworth's Doughnut through their living standards and environmental burdens. So he asks, for these living standards, how many burdens are put on the environment? In other words, how much pressure is put on the environment to obtain that thriving life for most people? What is the cost in terms of resources of living that, in that just and safe space? And the answer is quite pessimistic. According to O'Neill, while it is possible for physical needs such as nutrition, sanitation, access to electricity, and the elimination of extreme poverty to be met for all people without transgressing planetary boundaries, the universal achievement of more qualitative goals, like for example high life satisfaction, would require a level of resource use that is 2 to 6 times the sustainable level. In other words, every single nation that enjoys that middle circle is very likely to overshoot the ecological ceiling. When O'Neill examined quality of life relative to environmental damage, his research proved that the more stable a nation's social foundation was, the greater the tendency for that nation to overshoot planetary boundaries. Almost every nation satisfied social demands by sacrificing sustainability. So this is the inconvenient truth, and it can have unacceptable implications for the developing countries. Not only does this imply that every time we try to get our standards of living higher to reach a decent life, we must also sacrifice sustainability. But also developing countries must be prevented, they must be prohibited from developing economically, since they all want to follow the model of the West, meaning economic growth. So, does this mean that the global South is doomed to live in poverty beneath the social foundations? Well, no. According to Raworth, the issue isn't because we are consuming resources, but the purpose for which we consume such resources. If our consumption is driven towards other goals than economic growth, let's say towards questions of social justice, then the consumption of resources wouldn't put such a heavy burden on the environment. So, of course, the global South can develop economically, it just should be an economy that is regenerative and distributive. In that scenario, an increase in resource and energy consumption with the goal of, rectifying social injustices wouldn't cost us sustainability. As such, the gap between the North and the South can be bridged because, as it turns out, using resources for social justice is the most efficient way to use resources. Saito provides a few examples from Raworth's article, A Safe and Just Space for Humanity. For example, she argues that if we can save 860,000 people from starvation, we can increase the world's overall caloric intake by just 1%. That's all that it takes to end world famines. Compared to the burdens we put on the environment for growth, the burdens for social justice are insignificant. To provide the 1.3 billion people who don't have access to electricity with electricity, it would increase carbon emissions by only 1%. Takeaway here, the takeaway here is the emissions provided for the purpose of providing people with electricity is nothing compared to the emissions provided for economic growth. And lastly, she says that to end poverty, or more precisely to raise the standards of living of the 1.4 billion people living under the poverty line of $1.25 a day, would only take the redistribution of a mere 0.2% of the world's wealth. Like, that's all that it takes to eradicate poverty, a redistribution of 0.2% of world's wealth. But then, as Saito says in note 57, this line of reasoning can be wrong. When Raworth says that only 0.2% of world wealth can end poverty, she's talking about extreme poverty. She's not talking about poverty in the sense that you rely on unemployment allowance. If we take into consideration all layers of poverty, that will take way more than just a redistribution of 0.2%. And the emissions that is likely to be produced by such efforts cannot be overlooked. When Raworth made her figure of the Doughnut, that was in 2012, when the poverty line was at $1.25 a day, making it 21% of the population. In the article, Raworth gives a table where you see how many people are living under the level of the social foundation. In 2012, she only had 11 social foundations, and here's the figure back then. So you had food security, 13% of population undernourished, income 21% living below $1.25 per day, water and sanitation, 13% without access to an improved drinking water source, and 39% without access to improved sanitation. Healthcare, 30% is estimated to be without regular access to essential medicines, and education, 10% of children not enrolled in primary school, and 11% illiteracy among 15 to 24 years olds. About energy, 19% lacking access to electricity and 39% lacking access to clean cooking facilities. Gender equality, 34% of women face employment gap between them and men in waged works, excluding agriculture, and 77% in representation gap between women and men in national parliaments. Social equity, 33% living on less than the median income in countries with a Gini coefficient exceeding 0.35. As for voice, population living in countries received in surveys not to permit political participation or freedom of expression, jobs, labor force not employed in decent work, and resilience, population facing multiple dimensions of poverty, these are yet to be determined. But the point is, Raworth asserts that all of these populations can be pulled to the minimum levels of social foundations without causing much emissions. However, these numbers can be arbitrary. Who decided that $1.25 a day is the ultimate poverty line? Some have criticized this, saying that it is too low and instead argue that it should be higher. The World Bank now has set the line at $1.90 per day, and still many still say that these lines are meaningless, and up to set the line at $10 per day. Like, if you make less than $10 per day, you are below the poverty line. And so this would mean, as Saito says, that the environmental burden of pulling people out of poverty increases as this poverty line rises, which naturally makes it increasingly difficult to realize an economy that fits within Raworth's Doughnut. But that's beside the point, because the fact remains that promoting those goods instead of growth will ultimately emit less CO2 than human activities for the sake of growth. Like, her argument is that we already have everything we need for everyone to live in that circle of human flourishing, and without having to overshoot the ecological ceiling, all we need is just redirect resources to serve people's well-being instead of the GDP. Other examples that Saito brings are promoting democracy, gender, and economic equality. And so these ideals are not necessarily tied to economic growth, and they don't put any burden on the environment whatsoever if our human activities were oriented towards them. A concrete example for how to redirect resources in promoting social justice is redistributing subsidies spent on the fossil fuel industry. That would bring about economic equality and add not further burden on the environment, but is even likely to improve the environment. If you think that it's impossible, well, remember that subsidies for fossil fuel industries are up to $5.9 trillion. That is 6.8% of the world GDP in 2020. So, Raworth's work then shows that the myth of a correlation between happiness and economic growth is exactly that. It's a myth. If the point is to achieve that safe and just space for humanity, then we are already talking about happiness. And as economic growth necessarily overshoots the ceiling while undershoots the social foundations, it is clear that the relationship between growth and happiness becomes harder to discern. Like Saito says, once basic standards are met, it's not at all clear that the premise is true that only economic growth can cause society to thrive. A simple empirical proof for this is to compare the US with Europe. The GDP per capita of European countries is lower than the US's. But as Saito notes, European countries report higher rates of happiness. That's because although today France and Germany are seeing a growing hostility towards social welfare, their welfare state provides free healthcare and higher education to most of their citizens. But in the US, some people don't have access to healthcare because they can't afford health insurances. And many young people take student loans to enroll in college but find themselves in crippling debts that they'll never be able to pay back. I mean, Saito even compares Japan to the US. Japan, which is one of the countries with the highest rates of suicide and unhappiness, but is still happier than the US despite having a lower GDP too. Even saying, the average lifespan there is 6 years longer than in the US. Actually, Japan is the country that has the longest average lifespan in the world, according to the World Health Organization. And Saito gives in note 50A the ranking of life expectancies in the world from the WHO. So, a high GDP doesn't mean that your people are living within the safe and just space in the donut. You can even say that evidence points to the other direction, like the greater the GDP and the lower the standards of welfare and redistribution of wealth and resources, and so the greater the misery. Hence, Saito argues that a better indicator of how successful a nation is shouldn't be the GDP, but the HDI, the Human Development Index. The US, despite being the world's greatest economic superpower, ranks only 13th on the HDI scale. The highest ranked country is Norway. That's because the HDI doesn't really care about your GDP. It only calculates life expectancy, education, and per capita income. That's what should matter. And Saito argues that high HDI doesn't rely on high GDP or even on economic growth. Like, even if economies don't grow, if existing resources are distributed well, a society may thrive more than ever. In other words, the extent to which societies thrive changes greatly depending on how production and distribution are organized and how social resources are shared. No matter how much the economy might grow, if the resulting wealth is monopolized by one part of the population and never redistributed, large numbers of people will live in a comparative misery, unable to realize their potential. So from this, we get to the central question. All the debate points that it is possible, and it's the only way to actualize that possibility to remain in the safe and just space for humanity without economic growth. All we need is a redistributive, just economy. So the question now is that, can that economy be capitalistic? Can we conceive that a just distribution of resources can occur on a consistent basis within a capitalist system? But before we answer that question, it is important to remember what we said about this regenerative and redistributive economy. It cannot be a national economy, but only a global economy. What we need to realize is a just and sustainable society at the global level. If we only implement these economies to national levels only, then some countries will continue their growth-oriented economies, and as we've explained, growth can only be sustainable if a core exploits and externalizes onto a periphery. Growth grows like a cancer, and soon all nations will find themselves again forced to compete with one another. The northern countries rely on the southern ones to follow them in their model because the south is its periphery. The periphery can never enjoy a sustainable economy since it is a periphery. It is forced by the core to abundantly between quotation marks, to abundantly produce and exhaust itself to produce goods that it will unequally trade with the north, that the north that wishes to consume them to sustain its imperial mode of living. So clearly this cannot be a national solution, but a global solution. The entire world must follow a regenerative and redistributive economy. If the entire world, without exception, does not become part of a sustainable, just society, the environment will deteriorate until the planet is unlivable for everyone, threatening even the prosperity of the global north. So again, let's be clear about this. The point of a just and safe space for humans within a redistributive economy is also to avoid negatively impacting the environment. However, any kind of economic activities are going to produce carbon emissions. No matter what kind of economic model we adopt for the gap between north and south to be bridged, certain amounts of emissions must be tolerated. As the South tries to bring everyone living below the level of social foundations up into the range of sustainable prosperity, it will inevitably contribute to an increase in the overall global material footprint. But like Rowoth said, these efforts will only increase emissions to an incredibly lower degree than they would have if they were aimed at growth. So we have an advantage here, or an opportunity not to miss. We need to be very careful about this increase, given how fragile the environment is right now, with the planetary boundaries being transgressed or about to be transgressed. We don't want this increase to be fatal to it, so we have to minimize to the maximum its impact. It is thus necessary for the global north to be a team player here. The north, first mustn't use further resources for economic growth, because that would be a fatal blow to an environment barely breathing. This can be done by acknowledging that it doesn't need growth anyway, since we've seen that past the social foundation, economic growth doesn't improve the level of happiness and well-being. So there's literally no point in seeking it now. Instead, resources should be directed to directly improve the standards of living of those still struggling below the social foundations, mostly of whom are in the global south. In other words, we should set aside a part of the worldwide carbon budget, the amount of carbon dioxide emission the world can still safely allow, for the development of southern countries. Hence, it is imperative that the global north reduces its consumption, and thus the resources economic growth would have swallowed would be instead used to improve the well-being of the global population. It requires a certain humanism and empathy, but this is not calling for the power of love and friendship, but an emergency call, because it's either that or it's the apocalypse. Okay, in short, if we don't think, what does it matter if the billion people currently starving on this planet continue to starve, or who cares if future generations are left to suffer in an uninhabitable environment, we must seriously consider following a path away from the large-scale, wasteful cycle of production and consumption of the global north, and toward the scaling down of our material footprint starting at home. It's for this reason that both Roworth and O'Neill conclude their studies by saying that we should seriously consider transitioning to either a degrowth or steady-state economy. I want to state clearly that that at least up to this point, I agree with their overall assessment. So there you go. The move from an economy oriented towards growth to a sustainable economy is to adopt a degrowth economy. This is, like I said, must be a global measure, a large-scale initiative, and an initiative that cannot afford a mentality of après moi le déluge. But like Saito says, Raworth and O'Neill's view so far, well, he agrees with them. We need a transition towards a steady state and degrowth economies. But then, he's going to disagree on a very fundamental level about this. See, if Raworth and O'Neill are on the right track, that the transition towards a steady state economy requires degrowth, they think that such a transition can still happen within a capitalist system. This is where Saito disagrees. There is, however, a major feature of both Raworth's and O'Neill's arguments that leaves me in grave doubt: their shared unwillingness to question the capitalist system itself. This is where we can glimpse the distinctive characteristics of people pushing for degrowth while avoiding problematizing capitalism. The crux of the problem here is whether a truly just distribution of resources can ever be sustained under capitalism. So the answer is going to be a clear no. I guess you can see that coming. There can be no such thing as a degrowth capitalism or a post-growth capitalism, even if theoretically it can be conceived. I mean, it cannot. It's like, trying to think of a square circle, but let's suppose it can, okay? Even if you can conceive of it, the point of degrowth is to respect planetary boundaries. It is primarily for the environment that we need in order to be in that safe space that we require degrowth. The problem is that capitalism is just incompatible with respecting planetary boundaries. Its essence, its very premise, implies a lack of concern towards sustainability and ecology. We've also established that global justice is inseparable from environmental sustainability. So clearly, because capitalism is incompatible with environmental sustainability, it is also incompatible with global justice and vice versa. It is a deeply flawed, dysfunctional, and unhelpful system, as Saito says. So for capitalism to be a viable option for a degrowth economy, we need a capitalism that doesn't rely on externalization and displacement anymore. But those are the core principles of capitalism. If you have an economy that doesn't displace and externalize its costs onto a periphery, well, that economy is not at all capitalist. Since externalization and displacement are nowadays the causes of injustice, capitalism will always work against global justice. And like Saito says, if we abandon justice, then our survival will be even less likely than it already is in this climate crisis. So if we try this degrowth in a capitalist setting, it will force us to do it only at a national level, at best. You can argue that nations can save themselves by some sort of degrowth capitalism, but that will require an externalization somewhere, somehow. So it is not different from green Keynesianism. It's another way of saying, let's work together, but only to save ourselves. This is this in the face of a global crisis cannot work. At best, it will only buy us a little bit of time, but again, no amount of time bought will stop the crisis. As a matter of fact, the crisis will keep progressing, and the little time that we can buy by trying to only save ourselves while dooming others, it will always be at the cost of someone else's life. But as this strategy keeps going, we will eventually run out of time that we can buy. Soon, just like there won't be any space left for externalization, there won't be any time to buy. And let's not forget that this time bot is time for just the 1%. They can manage to survive longer than we do, so any time that we buy is actually a time for the 1% to keep enjoying their extreme imperial existence. This is how irrational they are. They rather exhaust as much as they can the world for their little pleasure rather than preserve the world and global justice. To be able to eat lobsters and flying 5 times a year to exotic islands, they're ready to destroy the world while knowing that even their lifestyle will at one point be doomed as well. It's like you tell them, your lifestyle is going to cause the apocalypse, and instead of renouncing it, they say, well, how much time can we have? 50 years tops? With all efficient economic measures to maintain this lifestyle, with all the time I can buy, I can only get 50 more years before the world completely burns down, while people's lives are thrown away for it? Deal. Okay, so this is how they think. That will happen. What will happen is that the 1% will apply greater violence as the crisis worsen, as the time we can buy shortens, meaning that inequalities between the 1% and the rest of the world keeps getting wider. Okay, these inequalities will keep getting wider and wider, and there won't be a middle class anymore. Okay, there won't even be a 20% riches, which, by the way, are also the 20% are also complicit in this. The middle classes, because they too want to keep their imperial mode of living, automatically allow the 1% to keep theirs. And as they see their lifestyle being threatened by the crisis, as they too will try to buy time, they will also try to exert as much violence on worker classes, on immigrants, and on people living in the South. Yet they too will run out of time, they can buy, and they cannot sustain that lifestyle anymore, leading to a collapse of middle classes. So they too will join the poorest 50% of the world at one point, and so barbarism and or fascism will erupt, as if it hadn't already. And therefore we need to act now with global justice in mind, with equality and real sustainability for all. This is what reality is demanding of us. When we talk about global justice, this isn't a utopia or an abstract ideal. It is a necessity. We have cornered ourselves to such a narrow point that now the only way out to avoid collapse and human extinction is by realizing global justice. For this reason, the issue of global justice is neither abstract nor a matter of utopian humanitarianism. Before giving up on helping others, take a moment and imagine yourself standing in their shoes tomorrow. In the end, the only way to help ourselves and improve the chances of survival for all of humanity is to help bring about a just, sustainable society for everyone. The key to survival is, above all, equality. So now we turn to the possible future scenarios that await us. What the future will be like is going to depend on the choices we make right now. This is where we go back to that famous phrase by Rosa Luxemburg from the end of chapter 1. What is it going to be, socialism or barbarism? Now, when we talked about Luxemburg in the first chapter, Rosa Luxemburg. It sounds more correct in French. I'm sorry, but anyway, Rosa Luxemburg. In the first chapter, we also said that Saito doesn't just believe in 2 futures, but 4 possible futures into the Anthropocene. Out of the 3, only one is likely to take us out of the Anthropocene. As for the 3 others, well, let's take a look at each one of them. We have the following figure that represents the 4 possible futures, and these are climate fascism, barbarism, climate Maoism, and then the 4th future named X. Each future corresponds to a combination between 2 points from the horizontal axis and vertical axis. The horizontal one is about resource distribution and social justice. We are equal or unequal. It ranges from the most egalitarian position at the left extremity of the axis to the most unequal position at the right extremity of the axis. And so that point where inequality is at its maximum is called by Saito total self-reliance. It's a situation where everyone has to rely only on themselves and fend for themselves only. It's kind of a war of all against all. And the vertical axis represents the concentration of political power, or more precisely state power. At the bottom we have a weak state power, and as we go up we reach strong state power. This is where you have totalitarian regimes at the top of the axis. So the four possible futures will depend on either we have strong state power but with equality or inequality, or a weak state power with likewise equality or inequality. Climate fascism, that's where we have a strong state power but inequality. Barbarism is when you have inequality with weak state power. Climate Maoism is strong state power and equality. And lastly, the scenario X is when you have equality and a weak state power. Now, it's worth noting that Saito isn't the originator of these four futures. Okay, in note 60, he mentions two scholars, Joel Wainwright and Geoff Mann, and their book Climate Leviathan, a political theory of our planetary future, as the source for, his inspiration for the futures, for the four futures. So let's talk for a moment about that book to understand the nuance, because Saito's futures resemble those predicted by Wainwright and Mann, but they differ. Let's start with the title of the book, Climate Leviathan. That's a direct reference to Thomas Hobbes, the 17th century English political philosopher, best known for his 1651 book, Leviathan. That was during the English Civil War. And so civil wars and how to avoid them is basically what the book is about. In it, Hobbes, he develops a theory of political authority and the origins of the state. He says that the point of the state is to prevent that people, kill one another. And for that, the state needs to have near absolute authority. It must be as powerful as the Leviathan, which is a biblical, mythical sea monster in the book of Job, Ayub in Islam. So Job, because he was abused by misfortunes cast upon him by Satan, by God, actually by God, because God made a bet with Satan. So anyway, he was abused by misfortunes, and so he cries out against the injustices that fell upon him and the faithful, good people who always loved and worshipped God. So Job is basically saying, well, I've always been a faithful servant, and I always been a good believer, and I always worshipped you, God. So why are you allowing these misfortunes to fall upon me? And so he was blaming God for not stopping them when he always loved God. And God simply he simply, goes like, how dare you blame me? Do you have any idea how powerful and just I am? And to show him how great he is, God, he basically taunts Job with the Leviathan, a sea monster that only God can control. And so Hobbes used it as a metaphor for the sovereign state. The Leviathan is a powerful artificial person created by a social contract to maintain peace and prevent civil war. In the Bible, the Leviathan is often interpreted as the chaotic force of nature that only its creator can keep in check. But Hobbes reimagines this creature not as a threat, but as a savior, a symbol of the sovereign state, artificially created through the social contract to impose order over chaos. But why does he reimagine it not as chaos, but as a savior for human society? Hobbes, he chose the title Leviathan to evoke fear and awe. Just as Leviathan inspired biblical dread, Hobbes' state must be strong, unified, and commanding enough to suppress human violence and selfishness. It needs to make everyone tremble in fear in front of it. And so this makes the Leviathan the true and only entity that has sovereignty. The state is the only sovereign, the only sovereign being, and he must be unquestionable in power above all others. The only thing that can limit it would be God, so in other words, no man is above the state, and also it stresses the need for artificial unity. The Leviathan in Hobbes's image is not natural. It is constructed by a social contract, a body politic made of all of the individuals who surrender their freedom to this Leviathan in exchange for security. Now, it is also worth mentioning, before we go back to climate Leviathan, that in 1668 Hobbes also wrote another book that was published posthumously in 1681 called the Behemoth. And the behemoth is also another biblical creature, which is the counterpart of the Leviathan, but this one is a land creature. Leviathan is a sea monster, the behemoth is a land monster. And in the Behemoth, Hobbes' task is to explain how we go from a monarchy to a civil war. It is mostly a historical book, a dialogue between a master and his student to understand how the English Civil War happened. It's a warning about the consequences of failing to establish order. So Hobbes' thought in the Leviathan is this: in the state of nature, where we don't have a government, men have miserable lives. In this state, there is no government, no law, no property, no morality enforced. Everyone has a natural right to everything, even to harm or kill others. And this leads to a situation that Hobbes describes as a war of every man against every man. And in such a condition, life is, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's the famous formulation. So to escape the horrors of the state of nature, people agree to a social contract. Each person gives up some of their freedom to a sovereign, a ruler, or a government. In return, the sovereign maintains peace and security. Crucially, the sovereign's power comes not from divine right, but from the consent of the governed. The people themselves create the Leviathan. And this already puts some nuance in Hobbes. People often reduce his idea to the famous phrase man is wolf to wolf, homo homini lupus, but they often forget the other part of that sentence, which is homo homini deus, man is God to man. And so this precisely suggests that although human nature is inherently selfish, we also value each other and recognize no other political authority but that of men. And if we work together by trading our freedom for the safety of all, we can enjoy fulfilling lives. But why so much power? As I said, the Leviathan's power is nearly absolute, because if the sovereign is weak, society risks falling back into the state of war. And importantly, Hobbes' Leviathan can be a monarch, an assembly, or any form of government, but it must be one. It must be unified and unquestioned in its authority. Now we can go back to Wainwright and Mann's book. Now, their interpretation of Hobbes is based on Carl Smith's philological analysis of Hobbes, and they apply that in the context of the climate crisis. We said that the point of the Leviathan is to avoid a war of everyone against everyone, which is the state of nature. But the authors, they argue climate change, if left unchecked, is precisely going to lead us down that path. In the context of climate breakdown, we are witnessing widespread instability, insecurity, mass displacement, and fragmented authority, which will lead to a Hobbesian war of all against all. So this anticipates the formation of a planetary sovereignty that, in the name of avoiding climate chaos, may legitimize extreme centralized control. Planetary sovereignty may claim legitimacy by, promising to secure global order, not from traditional warfare, but from ecological collapse and migratory instability. And so the sovereignty, which they call the climate Leviathan, is likely to combine global capitalist governance with technocratic management under the guise of climate mitigation. But that would only be one of the four possible futures. Climate Leviathan is a capitalistic system. It's a globally coordinated but capitalist and technocratic order dominated by major powers, can be like the US or China, and guided by experts, economists, and international institutions like the UN, the IMF, or the World Bank. And so this first scenario is aligned with Saito's climate fascism, where this planetary sovereignty will mostly try to preserve the interest of the elite. The poor, the global south, the marginalized communities will bear the greatest burden through displacement, restricted mobility, economic austerity, and exclusion from decision making. In other words, Climate Leviathan is an adaptive strategy of the kind that says that capitalism must adapt to climate change, and by adapting it means that capitalism must do what it is required to do in order to survive, meaning sacrificing the poor and the marginalized. After all, it's supposed to have unquestionable power, right? And this is promoted as a sort of lesser evil. It's either we sacrifice the global south entirely, or it is the war of all against all. But to clarify, Hobbes did put a limit to the sovereign's power, but those limits are very controversial. Like, the only time you don't have to do what the sovereign tells you is if it tells you to kill yourself. So you can argue that since Climate Leviathan is dooming countless lives to certain death, we don't technically have to listen to it. But anyway, so that's the first future, Climate Leviathan or climate fascism. The second future is like Hobbes, its counterpart, which is climate behemoth. They don't spend much time talking about this one. Here you have a reactionary nationalist backlash that denies climate change and reinforces authoritarian anti-globalist politics, like for example Trumpism. And so this future is the one absent from Saito, which he replaces it by barbarism. Then there is the third future, which is climate Maoism. Now you have a revolutionary anti-capitalist form of sovereignty, possibly centered on authoritarian eco-socialism. This one is exactly like Saito's. The authors don't talk much about these two because they believe that the most likely outcome is climate Leviathan. And lastly, they have a fourth future, which they also call Climate X. And this is a radical egalitarian alternative that resists both global capitalism and authoritarianism based on climate justice and a strong and deep democracy. But X, in their version, isn't a communist future. Though they take inspiration from communism, from Marxism, and from anarchism, notably from the legacy of Adorno and Horkheimer. Like we've seen, the book criticizes both liberal environmentalism for its technocratic optimism and market-based solutions, and parts of the Marxist left for neglecting the political consequences of ecological breakdown. But it is also anti-capitalist. It rejects the market as the central organizing principle. It's also anti-imperialist. It resists planetary governance that reinforces global hierarchies. It is also radically democratic, so not statist or technocratic. And it is committed to climate justice, centering the global poor, indigenous people, and frontline communities in decision making. And it is based on three principles of equality, dignity, and solidarity, so pretty much aligned with Saito's future X, although for Saito it is clear what that future is. That future X for Saito is degrowth communism. Now let's look at each of Saito's scenarios. What are the characteristics, starting with climate fascism and barbarism? So the reason why I am grouping these two together and then climate Maoism and X together is because of the nature of their relationship with the environment. You can say that you have two futures where you don't do anything about the climate crisis. We just continue to do things like we do right now, meaning without any serious challenge to capitalism itself. And you have two futures where you take seriously the climate crisis and try to solve it while challenging capitalism. So let's start with the scenarios where we let things the way they are. We either stumble into climate fascism or barbarism. And these two aren't mutually exclusive. Like, they can happen simultaneously or one leads to the other. In the case of climate fascism, you'll have an economic struggle between two classes. As the crisis keeps worsening, more people will be affected by the decreasing living standards that they'll face. And quickly, many people will no longer be able to sustain even the most basic lifestyle. They will lose their homes and become climate refugees. And by contrast, the super rich elite, they'll be fine. Not just that, but their wealth is most likely to increase as less and less of wealth is getting redistributed. More wealth usually used to sustain healthcare and welfare, and so this wealth will instead stay directly between the hands of this elite, which grows thinner by the minute. So the rich get richer because they basically end up gathering all of the wealth in the world, including also theirs. Like we've seen before, climate disaster for capitalists are business opportunities in which not only they can grow their fortune, but also kick some competitors out of the game. So the least rich of the super rich will also lose their wealth. And so it's basically an Attack on Titan scenario where you have, the different walls, and only the central wall is truly safe from the Titans, and there you will find, the wealthiest of all people. Those who are closer to the Titans, here I'm using them as a metaphor for climate change. Titans are climate change. So those who are closer to the Titans, they are the most vulnerable. So as the crisis keeps progressing, the walls begin to fall and the Titans are closing in. That's not what happens in the show, but you get the metaphor. As they are closing, the inner wall circle of the rich become richer, while those among the wealthiest who live near the last remaining wall will see their standards of living rapidly decrease, making them similar to the poorest regions who were sacrificed to the crisis for sustaining their lifestyle. So an even more brutal hierarchy is established, and persecution and extermination to keep the refugees from coming will skyrocket. The elites will then have a strong state power on their side to secure their wealth and lifestyle as it persecutes the growing refugee population. There are already aspects of this happening in Tunisia with the government of Kais Saied leading a ruthless political oppression against climate refugees from sub-Saharan regions. Like Saito says, nations will want to protect the interests of this special class of elites, and they will crack down on the climate refugees and other vulnerable populations that would threaten to overturn this order. This is the first future climate fascism. So you quickly end up with a 1% versus the 99%, with the state power on the side of the 1% and ruling with an iron fist to prevent any overthrowing attempt from the remaining 99%. Because quite normally in that situation, many people would have died already, but there still be a lot of them. This 99% will continue to grow as more and more people lose their living standards, lose their homes, and are forced into becoming more refugees. And with a growing refugee population, food will also become scarce as food production will collapse. And so the climate has already rendered most land unusable, and the only few lands remaining have been appropriated by the state at the service of the elite, or directly by private companies to only produce what the elite only needs and consumes. And so the outcome is clear. The starving population will revolt and overthrow the authoritarian states, but not to usher socialism, equality, and rational treatment of the land, but to the future foreseen by Rosa Luxemburg, barbarism. You have here a weak state and as much inequality. It doesn't mean that you still have the elite, but you end up in a situation of pure might makes right, of everyone for themselves, and whomever can steal, rape, kill the other will secure their food and resources. It's literally an apocalyptic scenario like we see in post-apocalyptic movies. There are no states in the technical sense of the word, but you have mafia-like organisms that rule with direct violence and terror on whomever their hands, on whomever they lend their hands. So it is Hobbes's war of all against all. As a result of climate fascism, populations suffering from starvation and poverty will start civil wars and uprisings. If there is truly a war between the top 1% and the remaining 99%, the latter will surely win. A rebellion of the masses would overturn authoritarian governments attempting to rule with iron fists, plunging the world into chaos. All confidence in the rule of law would be lost, and the world would descend into a Hobbesian state of nature, a war of all against all, in which nature would look out only for, in which everyone would look out only for their own individual interests. This is the second future, barbarism. So these are the two scenarios if we continue our perpetual search for our, perpetual dreams of perpetual growth. Now let's look at the other side of the spectrum. Let's suppose that people have awakened at the right time, when something could still be done to avoid the descent into barbarism. And so here too we have two options, two versions of socialism, with one less socialist than the other, I have to say. So here we understand the gravity of the situation. We also understand that in order to have a sustainable economy that doesn't destroy the environment, to remain in that safe space defined by Raworth, we need to bring in equality among people. To fight off inequality is by reducing the unequal disparities in wealth, in resource use, and in social status and human rights. Given the urgency of the situation, we cannot afford to wait for people to do this on their own freely. It has to be imposed. We have to force equality. This is a situation where you have a strong state power towards equality, and so this is climate Maoism. You have top-down initiatives and measures to combat climate change. The state takes all decisional powers, it regulates the market with an iron fist, it sanctions mercilessly carbon emissions, etc. Here's how Saito defines this third option. Some form of rule would be necessary to save society from the second worst-case scenario of a descent into barbarism. One way this might occur is by narrowing the wide wealth gap dividing the top 1% from everyone else and instituting top-down climate change policies. This would involve jettisoning the free market and liberal democracy and creating a centralized authoritarian dictatorship that would bring about more efficient and equal ways to combat climate change. This is the third future, climate Maoism. So, classic case of an autocratic nationalism and bureaucratic authoritarianism here, and this is the weakness of this model. Well, beside the obvious red flag of its authoritarianism, there's also the nationalism. This solution cannot be applied globally. Only nation-states take the decision to impose a bureaucratic socialist dictatorship that echoes, kind of Stalinist Russia or Mao's China. Besides the cost that would entail in terms of freedom of expression, there is again the limit of it being just a national measure. There is no state that is strong enough to be a world state or a global state in this third scenario. So not only this will be an unacceptable trespassing on fundamental human rights, it won't be that efficient either to combat climate change. And therefore the only option left is the fourth one, where you have equality, but not through a strong state power, but through mutual aid. Here the role of the state will just be confined to coordinate these mutual aid efforts, and this is future X. A fourth way, a way to resist both a slide into barbarism and some sort of autocratic nationalism, it's not impossible to implement democratic forms of mutual aid that don't rely on a strong nation to function, instead relying on individuals to voluntarily develop strategies for combating climate change on their own. This would be a just, sustainable future society. This fourth future has no name. For now, let's just call it X. So the rest of the book is going to try to argue in favor of that future because, as he says, out of all the possible future, it's the only one offering a chance at survival while preserving ideals of freedom, equality, and democracy. The aim of the rest of the book will be to elucidate the exact nature of this unknown future and how to achieve it. So that future will obviously be degrowth, but if what we said earlier is true, that this degrowth cannot be capitalistic, then what kind of degrowth is it? And does climate Maoism qualify as degrowth? Well, we can answer that right now and say not really, because elsewhere he'll say that climate Maoism is an attempt to control capital through sanctions and punishments. So it's not really trying to eradicate capital, more like limit it as brutally as it can. And we will see why you cannot have degrowth while at the same time tolerating capital. So obviously, X is going to be a socialist degrowth or degrowth communism. But what is that exactly? Well, before we answer what kind of degrowth that will look like, let's explain in further details why degrowth capitalism doesn't make sense and why degrowth cannot be achieved under capitalism. So we've seen so far that all attempts to save economic growth fail to lead to the preservation of a global environment capable of supporting all of humanity. Green growth and absolute decoupling are just illusions. They are only pushed because they hide the costs of the imperial mode of living. So we can say for sure that government policies intended to foster economic growth will never bring about an end to the global environmental crisis. What is needed then is to pull the brake on growth. In the first episode of the series, Saito argued that it turned out economic growth had an emergency brake that we witnessed during the pandemic. So it is possible to slow it down and even to stop it. That's why we need degrowth. And so that's the only viable option. So sure, we can agree on that. But now we get to the real question. Degrowth is meant to put the brakes on capitalism, run amok and bring about a type of economy that would prioritize the needs of both humanity and nature. So far so good. I am in complete agreement. But is there really a form of degrowth that can be sustained within the capitalist system? This is the question we must seriously consider at this point. So degrowth capitalism is basically a call to tame capitalism and to modify neoliberalism, to regulate it so that it remains within those boundaries between social foundations and ecological ceilings. But this cannot work because of the nature of capitalism itself. Like we explained, it is wrong to say that capitalism and endless growth are distinguishable from one another. They are intrinsically linked, and as a matter of fact, we can use them as synonymous at this point. You cannot say, I don't want growth, but I want capitalism, saying that implies that the root cause of climate change isn't really capitalism, but economic growth. Instead, we should say that the reason why we have infinite growth exhausting our planet is because at the root of it, we have capitalism. And no, it doesn't mean that if we take away capitalism, we can still have economic growth through other means. Shooting down capitalism is by necessity going to shoot down growth. Proponents of capitalism know this. That's why they insist on capitalism, because it's the only system that provides the conditions for eternal economic growth. If we could have infinite growth in any other way, then we would have discarded capitalism long ago. So this is obviously clear for Saito. The devil is capitalism. The devil destroying the global environment is none other than the capitalist system itself and its demands for constant unlimited growth. It's capitalism, nothing more, nothing less, that lies at the root of climate change and the other global environmental crises that come with it. So like we've explained many times already, the function of capitalism is to open new markets and extract value. It is by opening markets and extracting value that it is, that capitalism is possible. For it, there is no zone that is off limit to turn into a market. Every single thing that has the potential to produce value, capitalism will go for it. And of course, it is forced to have no limits, because the only way to extract value is by exhaustion. For value to be profit, it requires exploitation. And we don't need to revise the same dogma in capitalism here. The point of every company is to maximize profit, which means maximizing exploitation by reducing costs. This is also necessary since all capitalists are in ruthless competition. It is impossible for capitalism to run without painting all of its players against each other. And as such, all capitalists are forced to extract value as much as they can, which means that the burden put on not just natural resources, but also the labor force increase. That burden, the capitalists cannot bear it. If the capitalists also need to pay to repair the damages that they caused, then their profits would be null. Suppose that the value extracted from nature has led to the production of toxic waste. That waste needs to be taken care of. If the capitalist spends more money to make sure that the waste doesn't leak into the environment, that money is going to be spent from its profits. From his profits. And so this means a lower margin, if not zero profits. So what he does is he lets the waste back to the environment. He lets the responsibility to bear the waste that caused on someone else and on nature, destroying not only the natural world but also the lives that rely on that natural world. There's absolutely no way around this. Since capitalism needs to shift the cost onto the periphery, soon enough the periphery will be exhausted, unable to provide any value anymore. At that point, it is dead. So capitalism will have to move to another periphery. It requires to constantly open markets, because every time it does, it kills what it is extracting value from. If you say, no, capital, no more markets for you, or here are your zones, don't go to the ones there, just stay in there. Well, if you say that, well, basically what you are asking for is the death of capitalism. You are killing capitalism when you say that. Capitalism can only function through the exploitation of natural resources and human labor, a cost that is constantly externalized onto the periphery. That is the essence of capitalism. That's why it's a movement with no limits, as Marx says. Limits equals less profits, so capitalism's only mode of existence is that it will never stop growing to make profits. So what this means is that you cannot put brakes on capitalism and still call it capitalism. You cannot tame it or put limits on it. So you cannot say that you can stop growth while keeping capitalism. Moreover, capitalism won't be like, okay, I'm getting close to the point of exhausting the periphery, let's stop here and go exploit another one to give this one enough time to regenerate so I can, exploit it again. Besides the absurdity of such a life to the periphery, condemned to only serve capitalism, capitalism doesn't even think like that. When it sees a periphery on the brink of death, it doesn't go like, okay, I'll just let it rest, it had enough. No, actually it's going to exploit it even more brutally, because as it turns out, a dying periphery is more profitable than a healthy one. Climate change is a perfect example of this. As Saito says, capitalism sees even the worsening of the global environmental crisis, climate change and all, as just another opportunity to make money. A rampant wildfire is an opportunity to sell wildfire insurance. A plague of locusts is an occasion to sell more fertilizers. So-called negative emission technologies, as we've learned, may produce side effects that ruin the planet, but even these can be seen as yet more business opportunities. This is precisely what Naomi Klein characterized as disaster capitalism. So, disaster capitalism is a term coined by Naomi Klein in her book The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. It refers to the practice of exploiting crises, such as natural disasters, wars, or economic collapses, to push controversial neoliberal politics that benefit corporations and the wealthy, even at the expense of vulnerable populations. Like, instead of responding to disasters solely to help the populations, governments and corporations use the moment of shock and public disorientation to impose radical free market reforms like privatization, deregulation, and cuts to social programs. So this is called the shock therapy. It refers to a rapid and radical transition from a state-controlled, usually socialist or communist economy, to a free market capitalist one. The term is commonly used to describe the economic reforms implemented in the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and parts of the global south, like Latin America, in the late 20th century, often under pressure from Western advisors, the IMF or the World Bank. So the name comes from medical shock therapy, like electroshock treatment, a sudden, intense intervention meant to jolt a patient out of a dysfunctional state. In economics, the idea is similar. You deliver a sudden painful jolt to a stagnant or collapsing economy to force a transformation into a market-oriented one. So it assumes that gradual reform would only prolong suffering or allow resistance to build, and so instead you administer all the harsh medicine at once. So in periods of war and political instability or climate disaster, that's the perfect opportunity to smuggle in austerity measures. Quite often, Klein has noted in the US, in the aftermath of disasters, essential public services like healthcare, education, water supplies, etc., they are often sold off to private entities under the justification of efficiency or rebuilding. It is a strategic move because during crisis, populations are less able to resist due to panic, due to shock, or to emergency laws, and so this allows unpopular or undemocratic reforms to pass with minimal opposition. Klein gives the example of Hurricane Katrina in 2005. After the devastation in New Orleans, public housing and schools were privatized instead of rebuilt for the communities affected by the hurricane. Or in 2004 there is the Indian Ocean tsunami. In some areas, coastal lands were sold to tourist developers instead of being returned to local fishing communities. The same also occurs with wars. After the Iraq War, the US contractors and corporations profited enormously from reconstruction efforts, while Iraq's economy was restructured under neoliberal principles. And likewise, the fact that the periphery is in peril is actually another opportunity for capitalism to pass on neoliberal laws, or to sell insurance and fertilizers to a land already dying, thereby accelerating its dying process. So capitalism doesn't care at all about the calamities, the deaths, the lives it throws away, or the environmental damage it causes, as long as it can make its profits. And no, thinking that it will act rationally and think of long-term profits as if such thing exists, rather than being short-sighted, is not understanding capitalism. Capitalism exists for one thing only: finding opportunities to make profits. And in every situation where you put it, it will adapt to look only for that. You think that when things get extreme, capitalism will be like, okay, I learned my lesson, I won't suck the life out of you. Well, no, it turns that situation to its advantage. It's like, a cockroach. Whatever extreme conditions you put it in, it will adapt to it. So there is no stopping its linear movement. To quote Saito, it will never stop itself even when faced with something as terrifying as the environmental crisis. This is why if we allow things to continue as they are, capitalism will transform every inch of the Earth's surface into an environment unable to support human life. This is the endpoint of the Anthropocene. And make no mistake, if capitalism can adapt to every extreme situation you put it in, even thrives more in extreme situations, we, as human beings and life on Earth, we cannot adapt to capitalism even in its most inoffensive forms. Last week we said that one of the adaptive strategies of green Keynesianism is to go back to a 70s style of capitalism. If we go back to a lifestyle like that of the 1970s, there will be less burdens on the environment. Degrowth capitalism can also resemble that period of capitalism. However, we've already pointed to the limits of such hopes. Firstly, There are doubts about possible returns to a capitalism of the 1970s, but even if it were the case, well, how are you planning to keep it at that level? Again, capitalism wasn't sustainable back then. It was constantly aiming at increasing capital. And of course, at one point it stagnated because there were restrictions on it. But that didn't prevent it from breaking those restrictions because it had to. At one point, restrictions prevent capitalists to make profits, leading to a collapse of capitalism. Unemployment rises again, and this time, no intervention from the state will get the machine running again. So going back to the 70s, capitalism would simply risk falling into the same system failures that, threatened capitalism in the actual 1970s, and it will go down the same path as it did before to save itself. And in the end, the environmental crisis would just worsen once again. Let's not forget that 1970s style capitalism was already experiencing profound system failures, which necessitated neoliberalism to maintain it. The introduction of neoliberal reforms like privatization, deregulation, austerity, expanding financial markets and free trade. In other words, unhinged globalization. It caused the worsening of the climate crisis to catastrophic degrees, but that didn't came out of nowhere. It's not like 1970s style capitalism was doing well and then we suddenly decided to bring in neoliberalism. Okay, like Saito argues, this wasn't a fluke or a bad choice. It's not like we could have done things otherwise to save post-war World War II capitalism. No, capitalism was about to collapse, and if it collapsed, then it would have meant the victory of the Soviet Union and of socialism. The only way for it to survive was through neoliberalism. So to bring back capitalism to its 1970s model is to circle back to neoliberalism again. Neoliberalism isn't a fluke, but the logical course of capitalism. In note 61, Saito mentions a book that everyone should read to understand why the 60s and 70s weren't what these theorists think they were in relation to capitalism. So this book is by German sociologist Wolfgang Streeck. So again, we talked about Streeck 2 weeks ago, I think, and it's his 2014 book, Buying Time, the Delayed Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. Saito refers only to page 26, which is the section The Other Legitimization Crisis and the End of Post-War Peace, in the first chapter, From Legitimization Crisis to Fiscal Crisis. So the term legitimization is very important here and plays a role in Streeck's explanation for the transition to neoliberalism. The reason why post-World War II capitalism transitioned to neoliberalism in the 1980s was because in the 70s it was going through a legitimization crisis. It's when people no longer believe in legitimacy of the system and demand that the system changes. But who was the first to be dissatisfied with the 60s and the 70s lifestyle capitalism? Well, Streeck points to a weakness in Marxist theory and critical theory, that is, they only take legitimacy from the population, the masses, mainly the working class. The legitimization crisis doesn't contain two players only, citizens and the state/capital, but rather three players, three agents. Citizens or wage earners, the state, and capital, not state/capital. Political economic systems must legitimate themselves not only among the population, but also on the side of capital, or more precisely, to the profit-dependent owners and managers of capital. So a legitimization crisis may therefore also grow out of discontent on the part of capital with democracy and its associated obligations. The post-war Keynesian policies made the mistake into believing that capital is just a prosperity machine, capital are just functionaries obediently carrying out government economic policy. No, they are actors too who have the liberty to do whatever they want with their capital. Private property, meaning capital, is up to its owner to use. They can, in principle, use or not use as they see fit. Nobody can oblige them to invest. Thus, if they believe that the state's policies are more aligned with the interests of the wage dependents, meaning labor power, rather than the profit-dependent interests, they will object to the system's legitimacy and break the initial social contract. That's why we change the way we predict investments. We no longer use mathematics to know when the profit-dependent class may be willing to put their capital to work, as if it's mechanically and as if it is, a mechanic that we can predict with mathematical formula. But instead, we gave up on mathematics and we turned to psychology. Now we understand that they are willing to invest if you can show them it's in their interest. What Reek is saying is that after the Second World War, a new social contract was made. The state required the compliance of capital by making a deal with it. It cannot force it to do what the state wants because capital has power over the state as much as the population. The population wants higher standards of living, believed to be only attainable by growth, so growth and full employment. But only those in possession of capital are the only ones we also believe in a capitalistic system back then, of course. So those in possession of capital are the only ones who can make that possible. They can make the state meet the demands of the population. So both growth and full employment actually depend on the willingness of capital owners to invest. And to get that willingness, well, these owners need to be certain that there will be an adequate rate of return and a guaranteed security and stability of the capitalist economic order. Like, these are the conditions for capital to be content. If we are in an economic crisis in capitalism, then it means that capital is discontent. It's not very happy with how things are going. If they see their social environment as hostile and inclined to impose exaggerated obligations on them, they may lose confidence and withhold their capital through investment strikes until conditions improve. Like Reek says, low growth and unemployment are results of such strikes. Owners can invest their capital, but they can also refuse to do so because they lack the necessary confidence. The move from Keynesianism to neoliberalism was due to the profit-dependent class's dissatisfaction with the social contract, which it felt, inclines more towards the wage-dependent population. It's only natural. After 1945, the US government first needed to gain legitimacy in the face of the working class first, because it needed to rebuild things, and thus it started to make concessions with Keynesian theory to avoid also further Marxist influence in the working class. They thus agreed to government intervention in the business cycle and state planning to provide for growth, full employment, social redistribution, and even greater protection from the unpredictability of markets. But this also meant a gradual departure from capitalism, in a word of permanently low interest rates and profit margins. The capitalist class were absolutely right that Keynesianism would stagnate because it is designed to limit profit margins in the long term. But they also accepted the deal at first because, given the post-war conditions, it was the only way for a profit-oriented economic regime to be rebuilt within a stable liberal democracy immune from fascist regression on the one hand and Stalinist temptation on the other. So they recognized the legitimacy of the post-war capitalist system, but it wasn't supposed to last. They only recognized it only for the time it will restore their property rights and relaunch economic growth, but then all the social progress, supposedly protected by the US state, will have to go away, because it will obstruct capital interests and profit margins. The working class, well, saw this too. If the promises of the government about full employment and social security came to be true, an actual guarantee, then what is the point of profit margins going up at that point? They will no longer need capital managers since full employment is now possible. So capital then becomes scared of a revolution of rising expectations that it would no longer be able to satisfy unless it accepts a further decline in profitability and more pressure to save its private economy through a highly regulated and planned semi-public infrastructure. And so this enraged capitalists. Permanent full employment means the danger that workers would become over-demanding once they had forgotten the insecurity and deprivation associated with unemployment. At that point, discipline might break down at the workplace. We cannot have that, of course. And so this was the situation in the late 60s already. It was predicted in 1943 by Michael Kalecki. He's a Polish Marxist economist. It's spelled Kalecki. Because I'm not sure of the pronunciation. He was a Polish Marxist economist, and he's famous for his work on full employment. He said, capital has an interest in lasting structural unemployment, to warn employees of what they might face if their demands became excessive. So a long period of crisis-free growth and secure full employment is not at all aligned with capitalism. And like it broke the contract back then in the 70s and brought neoliberalism, which Streak discusses in more details in the next section, it will do it once again. Capital will never allow for the excessive expectations on the part of the labor force spoiled by affluence and the welfare state. The expectations of labor and capital are so far apart that the post-war regime of democratic capitalism could not but enter into a crisis. So with this in mind, let's now go back to Saito. All of this leads to the following conclusion: degrowth only makes sense in a post-capitalist system. Therefore, the only real way to face the environmental crisis head-on and control economic growth is to give up capitalism and bring about a great transition to a post-capitalist system of degrowth. Now, having said that, people can still be, defiant towards degrowth, because a lot of time when we say degrowth, people hear voluntary poverty. This is again something you can hear from developing countries as well, and not just individuals. They'll say, you want us to do degrowth, but that will just make us or keep us in poverty. You want us to be willfully poor. You want to prevent us from achieving prosperity and to develop economically. Or they will qualify degrowth proponents as idealists, people who live in their perfect little world and have no idea of what is real. They are probably people who are rich enough to sing the praises of downsizing and letting go of material possessions because they have no idea what it's like to be a worker and to struggle like a worker. They are unaware of how the real world works. In the real world, people need jobs or else they will be living in poverty. But to secure jobs, you need to be able to pay those jobs, to pay their incomes. But to be able to do that, you need economic growth. If you go degrowth, it means that you are going to downsize, that you are going to reduce human activity to reduce emissions. But that means unemployment for many people. It's the classic case of you wanting to protect against deforestation until you find yourself in front of the working class hired to cut down the trees, and they'll tell you that if they don't chop down the forest, they won't be able to feed themselves and their families. Also, less growth can mean less wealth for redistribution. It's like you have to bake a pie and the ingredient is growth. If there is less of it, the pie will be smaller, and so will the pieces of the pie. So less for everyone, whether in a socialist or a capitalist system. Those who oppose degrowth can say that even a socialist system that is obsessed with absolute equality and is planning to distribute the pie equally among its citizens, if their pie is smaller because there is less human activity, well, everyone will just be equally poor because their pieces will be smaller. And if you are talking in a capitalist paradigm, the fact that the pie is smaller, it means that wealth will become more concentrated in the hands of the rich because they won't be enough to reach the poor too. Now, wealth will not trickle down anymore. This is the trickle-down theory that says that wealth is like a champagne fountain, where you have a pyramid of glasses and you fill the first glass, and then that glass is once it is full, the champagne will keep pouring and is going to trickle down to the glasses below from the one at the top. And so these are going to get full in turn, and they will overthrow, leading to the other glasses to receive the beverage, etc. So let the rich get rich, and the more wealth they have, the bigger the pie, and it will eventually reach the bottom of the social hierarchy, and so the poor can lift themselves up. Setting aside the point about socialism, which we will go back to in another episode, to show its flaws. Let's just focus on the trickle-down theory because it is the crux of this criticism. This criticism is absolutely right. In a capitalist system, if growth stops, then there won't be any trickling down of wealth. But if we follow this theory, then it means that at the end of the day, what I need to empirically see that poverty is no more, or at least it should be, on the brink of extinction. We are. I just need, more growth. If I follow this, it means that with growth, I shouldn't see poverty anymore. We are, after all, in a capitalistic world, right? So how do we explain that poverty hasn't vanished? Since we are all trying to reach to maximize growth, and if we follow the trickle down theory, then all glasses of the pyramid should be full by now. There shouldn't be poverty anymore, or poverty would be really at the brink of extinction. But empirically speaking, that's not what we see. So how do we explain that poverty hasn't vanished yet with this theory of trickle down? And we're not talking about a small minority of people living in poverty, but billions. As of 2024, roughly 3.71 billion people live in poverty, meaning they make less of a $6.85 a day, which is about 46% of the population, of the global population. About half of the global population live in poverty. 1.85 billion make less than $3.65, and 700 million make less than $2.15 a day, which is classified as extreme poverty. So clearly, if capitalism allows for a trickling down of wealth, well, clearly it is not reaching everyone, and it isn't reaching them fast enough. And these numbers aren't only in the global south, but even in the global north. People's material conditions are actually worsening. As Saito says, our salaries seem to disappear before we know it, consumed by commuting and paying rent, phone bills, bar tabs, and the like. We have to scrimp and scrape, always putting back on what we spent on food, clothing, and social life. And then, as we barely manage to save what we need to support ourselves, we end up loaded down with student loans and mortgages, and we work as hard and long as we can every single day. If that is not a form of voluntary poverty, then what is? And Saito shows this graph. So in this graph, Labor share of income is decreasing, as you can see. It is lower than what it was back in the 1970s for Japan, France, USA, and Germany, so some of the OECD countries. So even if you want to say that the trickle-down theory is true, but if it isn't being seen in the global south, is because of the global south. They don't have, pure capitalism or real capitalism. You also have to explain why since the 1980s, the period in which we introduced neoliberalism, which again was a necessity to save capitalism, why the income share was also decreasing in the global north countries. You cannot say it's because of the commies trying to sabotage your government, because it's precisely in the post-Soviet era that these curves were going down. In the 70s, they went up, actually, in most countries except the US. In France, it was going down, but it rose in the mid-70s, but in the US, it was in decline ever since, even with the introduction of neoliberalism. In other countries, it was going up in the 70s until it plateaued around 77 and stagnated. Again, that stagnation was bound to happen and unemployment was rising. So they introduced neoliberalism, and as you can see, it is on the decline ever since. People are obviously getting poorer, not wealthier under capitalism, and the moments where they shared income increases are only temporal because it's always followed by crashes and economic crises. So no, economic growth doesn't mean that wealth is trickling down. On the contrary, in the eras where we had the most growth, we see the most brutal declines in shared income. So this means that growth equals a widening of the gap between the rich and the poor. And again, even if you say that it will take a certain time to happen, well, how long? How long should we wait, knowing that every 10 years there is a crisis that sets us back to worse than we were at square one? How much growth do we need before we can start laughing? Isn't 50 years enough already? The 80s, when we introduced neoliberalism, that's 50 years ago. Feeling old yet? Like we've been waiting 50 years for those curves to go up, and they are now lower than they were at the beginning of the 70s. I don't know if you understand what this means. The labor shared income refers to the portion of a country's total economic output, or GDP, is being allocated to workers in the form of wages, salaries, and benefits. So this graph shows the percentage of the GDP that goes to income. You can say that this doesn't mean that wages are lower. No, that's not what the graph is saying. It's not that we get paid less in terms of how much money a worker gets on his paycheck. What it means is that as growth increases, the part of the wealth generated by that growth, which goes to income, is decreasing, meaning that there is way more wealth going elsewhere than to pay workers. It's not going to sustain public infrastructure, because sustaining infrastructures is done by workers. That should be counted in the part of shared income, but rather that money simply goes as profit. It's the money that we are told businesses will reinvest to create more jobs, which they don't. Most of it either sits in their bank accounts, or they put it in private jets, islands, cars, mansions, or do tax fraud with it. In the end, if those curves decrease, if Japan's shared income goes from, for example, 65% in 1970 to 76 in 1977, and then drops at 61 at 2013, if the US goes from 70% in a constant decrease to 64% in 2013, if France goes from 78% to a slight increase at 81 and 77, but then drops at 69 in 2013, if Germany goes from 73% to 76 and now is at 68 in 2013, then for almost 40 years, the gap between the rich and poor is widening. So with these figures, it is clear that trickling down is not happening. Instead, the rich concentrate more and more wealth between their hands, and the very few drops that manage to get off the first cup in the champagne fountain, even if there are, more drops, poverty is more indicated by the gaps between the social classes than by the amount of wealth they possess. So even if you believe that somehow the trickle-down theory is true, but it just needs more time, you need to also remember that time during the climate crisis is becoming a luxury that we cannot afford. Capitalism in all of its forms and periods can never be a solution to climate change. End of discussion. But, like I said, despite all of these proofs that growth and capitalism are deeply flawed and cannot be a solution to the climate crisis, degrowth is still unpopular. It is seen as an ivory tower of naive hippies and selfish generations who, having reaped the benefits of economic growth, now want to keep those benefits to only themselves and shut the door of opportunity to those who still haven't got to the prosperity they enjoyed. That's how the third world countries, for example, react against degrowth. They expose it as an imperialist ideology that wants to maintain unequal development between them and the first world countries. But proponents of degrowth say the same thing. They say that those who wanted growth didn't care either about others or about the third world. The baby boomers, the population born in the 50s, they had their youth until the 70s. They enjoyed great prosperity, but that prosperity had consequences on the natural world and on the third world countries. And even on the next generation, generations who are left to deal with the consequences of their lifestyle. Baby boomers, according to supporters of degrowth, they are the ones who precisely shut the door of opportunities for others. They ripped off the benefits of growth. They already taken for themselves most resources of the earth and left the rest of the world to deal with barren lands, rising temperatures, and sea levels. So it is the proponents of growth, not degrowth, who are like, what does it matter if the developed world, slowly declines? And so this is why, according to Saito, degrowth, if it remains unpopular, well, it is nonetheless gaining more popularity among younger generations, especially Generation Z, now the OK boomer generation. But like Saito says, this sort of baby boomer style argument for degrowth has its antithesis. It is the modern monetary theory, the MMT, which is presented as an extreme anti-austerity position. And so before explaining what MMT is, very briefly, when I say that it's the antithesis of degrowth arguments, it doesn't mean that it is for neoliberal capitalism, because both degrowth and the MMT are against austerity. The point of this section is to say that even if degrowth remains unpopular, what is popular today is an extreme skepticism towards capitalism, because MMT is also very critical of capitalism. So MMT is a heterodox economic theory that views governments which issue their own currency as fundamentally different from households or businesses. According to MMT, such governments can create money to finance public spending without relying on taxes or borrowing, as long as there is unused capacity in the economy. Inflation is not ignored here, but it is treated as real constraint on spending rather than deficits or debt. MMT is often described as Keynesian because while it shares Keynesianism's belief that governments can stimulate demand through spending, it goes a little bit further. In Keynesianism, spending is typically funded by borrowing or taxation. It takes money already in circulation, but MMT flips this logic. Government must first inject money into the economy before they can tax it back. And another key feature lies in how each theory handles inflation. Keynesians often worry that too much money, especially if created by printing, will lead to inflation, so too much money chasing too few goods. But MMT agrees that inflation is a risk, but proposes that the purpose of taxation is precisely to control that inflation by reducing demand, not to fund spending. In this sense, taxes act as a brake, not a fuel pedal. And so therefore, under MMT, The government can spend to achieve full employment and other social goals while using taxes and other tools to manage inflation once the economy reaches its productive limits. The point is, MMT is in line with measures like green Keynesianism. So yes, it is anti-austerity and tries to prioritize people's lives. They compromise to revolutionize modes of production and social infrastructure as a way to combat climate change, and all of that is good. It's a wonderful thing to see more and more skepticism and criticism of capitalism and neoliberalism from the young. This new generation is called Generation Left. In note 63, Saito mentions a book about this phenomenon called Generation Left in 2019 by Keir Milburn. So Generation Left is a new political generation that has emerged in response to the 2008 financial crisis, which marked the collapse of neoliberal legitimacy, especially for younger people who inherited debt, job insecurity, and bleak futures. This led to widespread disillusionment with capitalism and the emergence of socialist and radical democratic alternatives among the youth, especially ecological awareness. And now they live in what Milburn calls zombie neoliberalism. It's a term to describe a system that continues to function but has lost ideological coherence and legitimacy. Like, institutions still train people to adopt neoliberal subjectivities, like be more competitive, be self-investing, but these no longer deliver the promised outcomes, especially for the young generations. So of course this generation is going to be characterized by left-wing political values, by anti-capitalist sentiments, and support for socialism and radical democracy. So there is something great about so many young millennials and from Generation Z who support candidates like Bernie Sanders in 2020, like Saito says, although he's a dipshit Zionist, which makes him more of a liberal than a socialist. But anyways, we can just take the fact that he gained more support from Gen Z rather than other candidates, like for example Elizabeth Warren, who did support many elements of the Green New Deal during her 2020 presidential campaign, but she did not run explicitly on Green New Deal platform the way Bernie Sanders or Ocasio-Cortez advocated for it. Instead, Warren emphasized climate plans based on market reforms, industrial policy, and anti-corruption, such as green manufacturing, clean energy investment, and decarbonization, generally more moderate than full-scale Green New Deal proposals. And so these half measures, as Saito calls them in note 63, they didn't get her the votes. Critics on the left, they did argue that her policies were too incremental and technocratic, and Generation Left generally favored Bernie Sanders, who had a more aggressive, socialist-aligned Green New Deal vision. So the point is that left-wing populism is rising, and it is a good thing. It shows very high levels of concerns for the environment and skepticism about capitalism. Some public opinion polls even show that more than half of the American members of Generation Z prefer positions aligned with socialism over capitalism. In note 62, he refers to, and Saito refers to, an opinion poll conducted by Gallup on August the 13th, 2018, about people's opinion on socialism versus capitalism. And so it is divided between Democrats and Republicans, then divided by the age of the population. And so the opinion poll is called Democrats More Positive About Socialism Than Capitalism, which isn't a surprise, although the socialism of the Democrats isn't communism or even remotely close, but at least it shows a minimum of defiance regarding capitalism. When you look at the numbers in the age divides between 2010 and 2018, it is obviously those aged between 18 and 29 that are growing disenchanted with capitalism way more than in the other age categories. From 2010 to 2018, the young population with positive views on capitalism went from 68% to 68 to 45%. Now, this doesn't mean that they are necessarily more inclined towards socialism. As you can see, the numbers don't really change. The only ones whose proportion increased in favor of socialism are the 30 to 49 years old, moving from 36 to 41%. But the point remains, more and more people are less attracted to capitalism. And so this can be due to the period of their birth. Gen Z are born in the 1990s and 2000, and it is an era where we have access to the internet and technologies to connect with friends around the world from other cultures, from different languages, etc. And as Saito says, in the sense, they have strong identities as global citizens. And so this sort of cosmopolitanism allows these young generations to not just bond with people from faraway regions beyond national borders, but they also see firsthand the contradictions of capitalism and its displacements. It has become more difficult for capitalism to hide its cost, the cost shifts, now that everyone is interconnected. The most prominent example of this is the Gaza genocide, where Zionist ideology can no longer hide its barbaric intentions towards Palestine and Palestinians. So the Palestinian cause has today way more support than it ever did, and not from international organizations or nations, certainly not Arab governments, but precisely from international people, notably Gen Z. And the declarations of Trump about, turning Gaza into a huge shopping mall may be caricatural, but that's the spirit of shock therapy, of seeing, humanitarian disasters as an opportunity for implementing austerity measures. So immediately, standing with Palestine is naturally linked with anti-capitalist sentiment. Naturally. So not only that, but as Saito mentions, Generation Z is filled with an anger towards the capitalist system, which is, perfectly legit because they, quote, experienced firsthand the widening of the income gap and the destruction of the environment that has accompanied the financial deregulation and privatization promoted by neoliberalism. There seems to be no bright future waiting at the end of capitalism's continued advance, only the ongoing need to clean up the messes left by adults. What can they do in the face of this but despair, and grow angry? So because Generation Z are, conscious of themselves as citizens of the world, and this played a huge role for their participation in two political waves mentioned by Mel Byrne, the 2018 global protest wave, the Occupy Wall Street in the Indignados, the Arab Spring, and the post-2015 electoral turn, Sanders in the US, Corbyn in the UK. So it's a generation that is involved in global issues and give local issues global support. We see this especially today with the Palestinian cause. So they are conscious that, the decisions taken by their parents and great parents are not only affecting them, but also affecting people all over the world. They have a strong sense of commitment to social justice and to change the world for the better, like Greta Thunberg. So all of this is good, but like we said, being anti-austerity isn't enough. The anger is much needed, but if at the end we are going to settle for compromises like the Green New Deal proposed by figures like Ocasio-Cortez and Sanders, we haven't done much with our anger. Saito mentions two problems with such compromises. The first one, which we already discussed, in that while the Green New Deal proposed by leftists takes a critical stance towards neoliberalism, its theoretical foundations are just reforms conducted within a capitalist framework. Here Saito mentions Robert Pollin and Noam Chomsky as theorists who embrace the Green New Deal, but he doesn't give any sources. But they had a conversation about this, which was turned into a book called Climate Crisis and the Global Green New Deal. Chomsky and Pollin, they are not degrowth theorists. As a matter of fact, they explicitly reject degrowth as a viable option in chapter 3 of that book, in the section where is the money coming from and going to. So both say that they share the hopes and values of the degrowth movement, but say that it is completely impractical, that you need growth to make people's lives better. They contend, however, that we can make degrowth in some industries, notably the most polluting ones, but that overall degrowth is just not viable. Pollin even makes the argument of voluntary poverty and points to all periods of degrowth as periods of unemployment and turmoil for the working class and the poor. But that's because those periods are crises like the Great Depressions and Depression, and secondly, they only think of degrowth capitalism, not degrowth communism. But anyways, the point is that they both embrace the Green New Deal, but want it to be non-profit oriented. They are sharply critical of efforts to co-opt the Green New Deal for profit-making motives, especially under the guise of green capitalism. They argue that profit-driven logic is structurally incapable of solving the climate crisis, and that such attempts can sabotage the deeper goals of the Green New Deal. But overall, they don't call for the overthrow of capitalism and try to make capitalism somehow compatible with non-profit initiatives to combat climate change, which again is a complete contradiction. Not only that, but they go as far as dragging Marx into this, and even the concept of metabolic rift. They contend that John Foster Bellamy is right in using Marx's notion of metabolism in rejecting, the effect that capitalism has on the environment, but they seem to think that Marx's critique is only applicable to neoliberalism, not capitalism in general. They even make the mistake of saying that Marx was in favor of capitalism, seeing it as a necessary historical step towards socialism, since but you know what, since we are going to address this point in the episode on Marx eco-socialism, so next week, there is no need to explain why that is false and why I never took Chomsky as a serious anti-capitalist writer. That's because he's not, and he's only using Marx when he sees fit. I think Chomsky is an opportunist in the Leninist sense of the term and an overall disgrace for anarchism, but that's another topic completely. Anyways, these theorists claim that we need growth, and that's why they are in favor of the Green New Deal, even though they claim to reject the business-friendly green growth policies version trumpeted by people like Thomas Friedman, for example. But then if they embrace growth while also saying that this is not profit-oriented and this is all in a capitalist setting, then this is a chimera, the kind in Full Metal Alchemist, that's just an unholy creation fated to an existence of pure pain, whose only act of mercy can, the only act of mercy one can do for it is to kill it. The elite know what I'm talking about here. In the end, because their non-profit goals is, their non-profit goals in activities that have huge environmental impacts are just wishful thinking, their whole proposal of the Green New Deal will end up doing all the greenwashing we've been criticizing so far. And there won't be anything distinguishing their Green New Deal from Friedman's. And so this leads to the second problem, and that is, as long as we have growth, you can't make it a lesser priority. If proponents of the Green New Deal try to somehow force capitalism into privileging, people's happiness over growth, the priority will always go to growth. And from there, we go back to the whole decoupling being a myth, etc. In other words, anti-austerity is a form of compromise, even as it critiques neoliberalism, it insufficiently critiques capitalism. After all is said and done, it is clear these programs will never truly foster degrowth. That's what's truly necessary to address the needs of the younger generation is a Green New Deal without growth. In note 64, Saito mentions a particular book called Degrowth, a vocabulary for a new era, edited by Spanish scholars from the Autonomous University of Barcelona, Giacomo D'Alisa, not sure of the pronunciation, Federico De Mari, and Giorgos Kalis. It's what the book's title suggests. It's a dictionary for degrowth vocabulary. And Saito mentions it here because these scholars are young. They are from generation left, and so they can provide the younger generation with the tools to understand degrowth and take it seriously. So it's a book for Degrowth-curious, but we will come back to it in a bit. An interesting point that Saito makes, and this is also why he has such high hopes for the new generation, is because the new generation is bolder than the older generation in their radicality. They're more willing to challenge capitalism and growth rather than settle for a compromise. Chomsky is a figure of the old generation, still defiant towards degrowth, or defiant towards degrowth communism. Most degrowth proponents still try to make it work in a capitalist framework. But overall, degrowth skeptics say that we will always need growth. What we have to challenge is the system of redistribution of such growth. They say that as long as economic growth continues and its blessings are shared among the majority, people will be satisfied and society will be stable. But none of the solutions are actually working, and so it's time to throw all previous attempts still grounded in the status quo and opt for the revolutionary solution. Hence, we need to turn to action that doesn't figure in any current or old paradigm. The appeal to Generation Z is an expression of that, of giving up on old paradigms and embrace a truly new revolutionary perspective. Another expression is the appeal to direct action rather than top-down policies. Saito emphasized the revolutionary aspect of environmental movements, which again are rising all over the world, which highlights the need for a global international movement. Top-down policies are always limited within their national borders, always trying to put the interest of their citizens above those of others. However, direct action movements don't care about that. Even if they are more local, the underlying philosophy of such actions have no concern with national borders, and therefore they are global. What is needed is their coordination. We'll come back to that as well. So Saito praises movements like Extinction Rebellion in the UK and the Sunrise Movement in the US for their models of resistance that involve direct actions like strikes, sit-ins, and property destruction, sometimes performed even in the face of certain arrest. And so such movements aren't just limited to average citizens and students, but they also manage to gain support from Hollywood actors and Olympic gold medalists as well. This is to say that the voices of such movements are even heard by powerful people, and whatever attracts the attention of the rich means that it has leverage against them. Two, they can be turned into opportunities to make businesses, polish their image, and they can turn into a spectacle. But whatever has the potential to produce value has also the potential to take it away. And that's the point. For movements calling for direct actions to be heard like this means that the ruling class sees it as a potential danger, and that it is shaking the foundations of the ruling class's credibility. So far, the ruling class has been inclined to the liberal left because the liberals, they are docile enough to play by the ruling class's rules. They're ready to turn their backs on the worsening state of the environment if it means having to sacrifice economic growth. That's why the liberal left's anti-austerity measures cannot be taken seriously. Like Saito says about those measures, they will only go so far as green Keynesianism is willing to go, and all of their efforts will wind up being just more ways for capitalism to restabilize itself. So this is a sharp contrast with the movements of direct actions, which, according to Saito, these are movements that have the potential to overcome capitalism as well. And here Saito only gave two examples from global north countries, but he will later emphasize similar movements from the global south, which are actually the originators of such actions. The groups he just mentioned are actually following models from global south movements. But this again highlights that growth and capitalism are gaining less and less support, even in the places where they are supposed to have most support. So this should motivate us towards not just reformist but revolutionary options, which now are the only options that can actually do something about the crisis. Now we have a chance for revolutionary action. The present age of environmental crisis offers us a chance to step through the door leading to a much more revolutionary, complete political transformation than that. So it is true that most voices are still trapped within capitalist settings and not brave enough to abandon growth and unleash, their imagination about actual possible futures, instead of putting their imagination in sci-fi scenarios like, with nets. Saito praises imagination, and it's precisely what we need once growth is abandoned. The already existing paradigms are narrowing our imagination and trapping us into adopting policies that don't solve the problem. And again, this problem has started because of economic growth and capitalism. There is no reform that can make us, a growth-oriented capitalism that won't destroy the planet. There is also no reform that can get rid of one while preserving the other. There cannot be a green growth without capitalism, and there can be no capitalism without growth. So the only option left for us is a post-capitalist degrowth. It is only in this realm that imagination can truly be unleashed to imagine this future socially, global just society. So this means that degrowth theorists who want to have a capitalist form of degrowth lack imagination by Saito's standards. So it can be helpful to pause a little bit and take a look at the history of the degrowth movement, because it actually has generations. And this is where we come back to the book on degrowth's vocabulary. We can say that Saito is from the new generation of degrowth theorists. The first generation of degrowth goes back to the 70s and all the way through the 90s. And the second, you have the second generation from there, which is Saito's, but also D'Alisa and his co-editors of the vocabulary book. So Saito is from the second generation. The first generation is best represented by André Gorz and Serge Latouche, both French theorists, though Gorz was prominent in the 70s and 80s. And by the way, Gorz is the first to use the term décroissance, degrowth in French, in 1972, while Latouche is mostly known in the 90s and is still alive and kicking. Gorz died in 2007. And according to Saito, both of these theorists, they call for a degrowth capitalism, which makes their theories outdated, although he'll come back to Gorz because there's something really interesting in his theory on technology, which is still very relevant for us today. But overall, these two are also from the first generation of eco-socialists. Now you may say, wait a second, didn't you say that they are degrowth capitalists, but now they're eco-socialists? And well, there's an explanation for that. Now, to be fair, Gorz and Latouche, as well as most degrowth theorists, they are explicitly, most of them, as I said, from the first generation especially, they are mostly, openly, explicitly anti-capitalists. The problem is that they are also anti-Marxists. Like, they engage with Marxism and they use his critique of capitalism, but their future degrowth societies, they are not communists. They are not capitalist societies, but they are not communist either. And D'Alisa and his colleagues, they seem to follow that course. The term communism appears only twice in the vocabulary book. And it is to highlight that degrowth theorists, they are not communists. For example, in the introduction, section 3.4, titled Degrowth and Capitalism, they imply that communism is a consequence of capitalism's collapse parallel with fascism. They even suggest that communism is an obstacle for degrowth. For example, in the 34th entry on cooperatives, which they take to be an essential form of organized work for degrowth, they say that cooperatives had to face a lot of difficulties because they were co-opted by communist dictatorships like that of Czechoslovakia, which they also parallel with Franco's Spain. So clearly, even though many degrowth theorists explicitly endorse anti-capitalist views, for Saito, this refusal to take communism seriously makes them, indirectly accept capitalism back in the end. In that same section, from the introduction, some even suggested that degrowth can work with capitalism, while others simply dismissed the question of what the post-growth society might be, capitalism or something else. Now, why this disdain towards communism? Now, this is also something we will see in Marx's eco-socialism next week, that even ecological socialists, social theorists like Gors, for example, they didn't like Marx because they believed that he was a Promethean, who has but little respect to the earth. Marxism is deadly to the environment. Gors was one of those critics we mentioned, and we will explain what is Prometheanism. But his rejection of Marxism when it comes to ecology led him to he had to accept capitalism, even though he spent all of his time criticizing capitalism and rejecting all the institutions that support it. And so this, according to Saito, meant that he ended up trying to fit degrowth with capitalism, even if he claimed that all of his life, his project is explicitly anti-capitalist. That's because, according to Saito, whenever we attempt to argue for degrowth within the framework of capitalism, we inevitably find ourselves mired in negative images like stagnation and decline. And, well, this is true. If people don't trust degrowth, it's because since its proponents want to distance themselves from communism and try to make degrowth a new whole project, an exclusive alternative to all economic systems so far thought of, in reality it's always framed within capitalism. And as such, it will lead to this voluntary poverty. To call for degrowth within capitalism, no matter what form we are talking about, means really a call for stagnation and decline. Plus, most non-Marxist leftists at that time are all haunted by the Soviet Union and the Gulag. This is Latouche's point, who gained notoriety in the 90s, right after the fall of the Soviet Union, and Saito says it plainly. This limitation can be traced to the historical background against which all the theories of degrowth were formulated, namely the fall of the Soviet Union. As the world-famous French first-generation degrowth theorist Serge Latouche put it, they see Marxism as nothing more than the fantasy of an impossible return to the past. In this context, degrowth becomes merely an attempt to reinstate liberal leftism as the order of the day. Now, Saito's reference to Latouche is weird because in note 65, he gives the reference to Latouche's claim about Marxism being an impossible return to the past. But the source he gives is a Japanese translation by Nakano Yoshihiro. But I managed to find the original title of the book. In the footnote, he wrote the title in Japanese and then translated the title word for word, which gives a different title than the original. So the original book by Latouche is Petit traité de la décroissance sereine, and in English it's translated as Farewell to Growth. And so you'll find the phrase around the middle of the section, is degrowth soluble in capitalism, in chapter 3, A Political Program. And the whole sentence reads, our conception of the degrowth society means neither an impossible return to the past, Marxism and Soviet communism, nor a compromise with capitalism. And so Latouche insists on this, that criticizing degrowth means criticizing growth means criticizing capitalism. So he insists many times that he is not arguing for a version of capitalism, but he's advocating for a post-capitalist society, but more radical than a post-growth society. But at the same time, he says that Marx, although he critiques capitalism, he doesn't critique growth. So we have to abandon Marxism along with capitalism and to all, and all growth alternatives. But Saito says that this is where these degrowth theorists fail, because they take Marx as a growth theorist and a productivist. They don't realize that you actually can't get rid of growth without Marx. That the only way to get to degrowth is through communism, which will only lead them back to embracing capitalism and somehow find a way to convince people that they are not calling for a stagnation or decline. So pushed into this corner, their theories end up being just lip service for liberal leftism, which is basically humanism, which only looks at issues through the lens of humanist values, and therefore they tend to reject the left-right political spectrum. Latouche, for example, in Farewell to Growth, insists that the degrowth project is neither left nor right. There's a tendency to classify degrowth theorists on the right because they are anti-modernity, and so they tend to be viewed as reactionary rather than revolutionaries. But Latouche says that we shouldn't play the game, is this right wing or left wing, because it will only distract us from real issues. It will lead to politicking, as he says, to make the degrowth movement a political party. But in the case of the climate crisis, degrowth theorists say that they are neither left nor right, because the climate crisis is a universal issue. It's a problem that concerns everyone, not just the people on the right or people on the left. So nature is a universal concern, whether one, happens to be rich or poor, a leftist or a right wing. So we can't tackle climate change through class struggle, for example, because the climate isn't just, the working class's problem. And so this leads Saito to conclude that in the end, these theorists, they don't really care about transcending capitalism or go beyond it. And so they don't take capitalism as a serious framework for understanding the issue. After all, if the alternative to capitalism, meaning communism, let's say, is just as bad for the environment, then there is no point in criticizing capitalism with the goal to overthrow it completely. So capitalism or communism, whatever, none of them serve as a framework to understand climate change. Whether one is progressive, a communist or a conservative or even a fascist at that point, it doesn't matter, because none of those ideologies talk about nature on a fundamental level. So they have little use of Marx here and there, but then, this means that they weren't aiming to move beyond or past capitalism, or more accurately, their methods won't allow them to do so. Hence, they make a huge mistake of thinking that you can take growth as the framework to understand why we are in the climate crisis independently of capitalism. They are forced to separate the two, even when they say that they are anti-capitalist. Marx, on the other hand, he doesn't make this distinction. He insisted times and times again that you cannot make this distinction between growth on the one hand and capitalism on the other. Like the two always go together, and the only way to avoid making this mistake is if you adopt communist logic and communist epistemology. Without that, you end up arguing that all we need is to introduce the right regulations, the right laws to prevent capitalists from destroying nature, and thus, we will reach degrowth policies. Now, we can say that Saito is a bit harsh, and he is kind of strawmanning the arguments of Gores and Latouche. But when we go to Japan to see the Japanese degrowth movement there, well, then Saito's criticism is accurate, and it is true. Yes, there is a degrowth movement in Japan, where despite of degrowth growing popularity, it mostly remains degrowth capitalism. And this time it is explicit. He mentions two examples, Yoshinori Hiroi and Keishi Saeki. When these two use degrowth to critique capitalism, well, they seem to only critique neoliberal capitalism, not capitalism itself. For them, all we need for a degrowth capitalism is just a strong welfare state that imposes limits on capitalism and regulates markets to not let capitalism get too much profit to the point where it puts a heavy burden on the environment. Hiyori, for example, says that in order to get a steady state society in Japan, we need a sustainable welfare state and welfare society. Saito quotes him where you will find explicitly a condemnation of capitalism on the grounds of values, not on the grounds of its inherent contradictions with nature. One thing I would like to make clear right from the outset is that the steady state society I am envisioning would not involve the abandonment of a market economy or the pursuit of self-interest. In other words, a steady state economy is not a socialist economic system. It is a conceptualization of society that transcends received binaries of capitalism versus socialism or freedom versus equality. Now, I'm not going to give you the book's title because they are in Japanese and there is no translation yet, so I don't know how accurate this is, but I take it that Saito doesn't misrepresent their arguments. So what we have here is basically saying that capitalists, not capitalism, are bad because while they have a system that allows us to use efficiently resources to create a perfect society where everyone is cared for, capitalists obstruct this by using the system for their own self-interest, which isn't a bad thing. It's just bad when there is too much of it, apparently. When there is no state power to regulate it or to coordinate these self-interests so that they converge for the benefit of society and nature. So his idea of degrowth is still grounded in market economy and self-interest. We just need to find the formula to turn the fable of the bees into reality, and that's all. The Fable of the Bees, for those who don't know it, is a fable written by the Anglo-Dutch social philosopher Bernard Mandeville in 1714, which is an allegory about a beehive where all of the bees, they guarantee the survival of the hive because they are each working for their own interest. Each bee is only after its own interest, and somehow their interests, they all converge for the greater good. But as soon as they become altruistic, the whole hive collapses. And this is what Hiroi is advocating for, a regulation to make sure that self-interests don't conflict. So he is explicit when he says that a steady-state society isn't a socialist society. It doesn't require to tackle capitalism on the ground of its economic conception. It's just to make sure that people treat each other with respect and decency. And for that, the economy of the state is just a welfare state economy, nothing more and nothing less. So clearly here, all the notions of class struggle or reification are not relevant at all. The only problem with climate change is that it is not the consequences of capitalism, but unregulated and uncoordinated chaotic self-interests. Somehow, degrowth, assuming that capitalists looking for their self-interest by this idea and accept to relinquish growth. But yeah, somehow degrowth will make climate change disappear because, again, it's not the internal contradictions of capitalism, but the growth-oriented goals of economic agents. Likewise, the other guy, Sayeki, says the same thing. He too insists that he's not promoting the escapist path known as socialism, so he doesn't want his degrowth idea to be associated with socialism or communism because everyone assumes that the minute we say degrowth, we mean communism. So he has to say this. In the present environment of competition-based economies and competitive growth, the promotion of accelerated growth at any cost by monetary authorities all over the world via the supply of excessive amounts of liquidity will lead to the destabilization of money markets, including the creation of bubbles that will inevitably pop. Degrowth is nearly the only way left to ensure that capitalism remains stable. So again, the book isn't translated, so here again, while he acknowledges that yes, accelerated growth simply means an acceleration towards the next economic crisis and market collapse, he doesn't see this as a fundamental flaw in capitalism, but rather a contingent event. Things don't have to be this way. With the right reform, the right breaks and limits, we can keep capitalism from collapsing. Degrowth's adoption then is not to end capitalism, but only to keep it stable so that it doesn't do too much, it doesn't fall into hubris. Both then say the same thing as Gors and Latouche. They first take it for granted that the Soviet Union's collapse is a proof that socialism in the Marxist tradition cannot work. It's not an option, no. And therefore there is no return to it. So forget socialism, forget about Marx, bury it and never dig it up again. If we are going to have socialism, it's going to be a non-communist socialism. But what would that look like? Well, Saito seems to suggest that this non-communist socialism is just going back to socialism, going back to capitalism, but the capitalism like that of the 70s. So much so for talks of impossible returns. And now, I don't think that degrowth theorists are asking for a return to 70s style capitalism, but Saito seems to suggest that without communism, well, that's where you are heading. At least it's more explicit in the Japanese degrowth movement than it is in Western degrowth movements. So to sum up, these movements, they basically say, now that we all agree that capitalism has gone too far and it is destroying the planet, since we've ruled out the possibility of socialism from the get-go, we are left with only one option: tame capitalism. So we have to somehow believe that capital growth can be halted while supporting a capitalist market economy. This is again the social democrats with their reformist methods, too scared to do what it takes to combat climate change and think that their social democracy will be of any efficiency against neoliberal market fundamentalism, and that there can be such a thing as sustainability in capitalism. So the naivety of such measures, or maybe cowardice, is perfectly expressed in this paragraph by Saito. He says, if this is true, there is no need to bring about any fundamental changes to the relationships between wage labor, capital, and private property, nor to the competition for profits in the marketplace. All that needs to be done is instituting appropriate incentives and organizational planning to fully mature nations as their material consumption reaches a state of saturation. As long as this occurs, the argument goes, people will voluntarily engage in the various activities associated with the social and public sphere that fall outside the pursuit of profit in the free market. And so we're supposed to buy that there can be in a capitalist society an area outside the market logic, or that cannot be open to markets. Remember what we said earlier, that capitalism is constantly trying to open markets everywhere. And so social democrats like Saiki and Hiroi, they believe that we can tell capitalism that there are areas that are off limits, and capitalism will be like, sure, I respect that. This is how their degrowth operates. It simply tells capitalism that there are things you cannot submit to market logic, things that fall outside the pursuit of profit and of the logic of private property. They hope that if we let capitalism have its profits somewhere, it won't invade the social and public sphere, which also includes, the environment. So that hope, according to Saito, is, extremely optimistic. The belief that institutions will be able to keep capitalism in check is just delusional. That's why social democracy has never been able to contain capitalism, and it always ends up leaking out into the off-limits areas. So Saito brings in another argument against social democracy of this guy, this time from Slavoj Žižek against Joseph E. Stiglitz, another Nobel Prize winning economist back in 2001. He won the prize with two other economists for their analysis of markets with information asymmetry. Now, information asymmetry is when one party in a transaction has more or better information than the other, which gives them an unfair advantage. For us, simple example, you're buying a used car. The seller knows that the car's true condition. Maybe it has engine issues. You, the buyer, do not know this. And that's information asymmetry. The seller has better information and may exploit it by overcharging or hiding problems. But anyways, it's unrelated to climate change. So Stiglitz became famous for his harsh criticism of the excesses of globalization. This is a recurring theme in these critics. They always attack the excess of capitalism or of globalization or of growth instead of those notions in themselves. They always do external criticism. They rarely do internal criticism. They also criticize the uneven distribution of wealth and the domination of the market by large corporations. He even recognizes the dangers for democracy with these things, with these phenomena. So what is his solution? Well, it's something he calls progressive capitalism. In note 68, Saito refers to Stiglitz's book, People, Power and Profits, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent. It is about what it says, how we can make capitalism progressive, more just and egalitarian. And so he understands that faith in the free market is dangerous and is likely to worsen things up because the free market is never free, meaning that it needs rules. Like he says, markets, they don't exist in a vacuum, they have to be constructed, they have to be structured, and the way we structure them affects both the distribution of market income and also growth and also efficiency, etc. So if it's not the state, and by state here he means democracy, who has power over it, it's going to be corporations. And they will only use it to their own advantage, putting workers and those who don't possess capital in a severe disadvantage. And as such, the state needs to intervene to make sure that no one is being taken advantage of. So the wealth created by the market cannot be left to the corporations to decide how to distribute it, because we know how that is going to play out. Capitalists will keep more of it to themselves and give as little as possible to workers or to welfare programs. That's exactly what we've seen with the last graph. The curves of shared incomes will go down, and not because of welfare or social security, but because corporations want to keep it in their pockets. Hence, we need a state to raise workers' wages and additional taxation of the super rich and of major industry, along with stricter prohibitions on monopolies, the rigorous enforcement of antitrust laws, for example. We need higher capital gains and inheritance taxes, greater spending to broaden, access to education, corporate governance reforms that, circumscribe executive pay, and also financial regulations that rein in banks' ability to exploit the rest of society. And so such measures are from Stiglitz's book, and he argues they would reduce inequality and increase equality of opportunity. But these measures, again, they are not calling for ending capitalism. They are just reforming it. They are just trying to limit its scope and redirecting it towards progressive causes. That's why it's called progressive capitalism, where the average person can belong to a comfortable middle class. In short, we can again tame capitalism by changing laws and policies through democratic elections. And so Stiglitz is here arguing for a way to revive economic growth. Now, he's not talking about degrowth, he's in a more Keynesian line. But all degrowth theorists also follow the same logic. So Zizek comes in, and his criticism to Stiglitz also applies to Latouche, Gors, Hiroi, and Sayeki. So what is that criticism? Well, this is from his 2017 book, The Courage of Hopelessness, Chronicles of a Year of Acting Dangerously. So, the criticism against Stiglitz is in the section Don't Underestimate the Fetish of Democracy in the first chapter. The first chapter is called Global Capitalism and Its Discontents. But Zizek's source for Stiglitz's views isn't his book on progressive capitalism, but an article where he makes the same claim as in the book. The article is Democracy in the 21st Century, published in 2014 in Project Syndicate, an international non-profit media outlet. Now, Zizek makes two criticisms. The first one starts by showing a similarity in Stiglitz's reasoning about democracy and Thomas Piketty's Capital. Piketty is the French economist who wrote Capital in the 21st century, and Stiglitz's article is clearly an echo to Piketty's work. According to Piketty, capitalism isn't going away anytime soon, so the sole feasible alternative is to simply limit capitalism to its own sphere, where it can do its work freely without letting it spread to other spheres of everyday life, and especially of justice. So these are the spheres of democracy where we impose egalitarian justice politically through democratic power that regulates the economic system and enforces redistribution. This is also Stiglitz's position. The problem isn't how markets work, but with our political system, which is, unrelated to our economic system and which has failed to ensure that markets are competitive and has designed rules that sustain distorted markets in which, corporations and the rich can and unfortunately do exploit everyone else. In other words, in order to effectively change capitalism, we would also have to change the functioning of our democracy. This is not something that we can argue against. Now, of course, we need to change democracy, but Stiglitz and Piketty limit change to only the political. It is simply a question of enforcing new rules, laws regulating economic life within the existing democratic framework. We need an elected government to pass some simple changes, as Stiglitz called them, simple changes. Like, this is the actual term that Stiglitz uses. And so this presupposes that the changes are not that radical because we already have the fundamental stuff to make things work. So here lies the first criticism. If it were possible through elections to bring increases in taxation, including corporate taxes and social welfare spending, why hasn't it already happened? If all that it takes are small changes, then this needs to presuppose the already existing global power with the strength and authority to enforce them. However, as Zizek says, such a global power is unimaginable within the confines of today's global capitalism and the political mechanisms it implies. In short, if such a power were to exist, the basic problem would already have been resolved. So why haven't they been resolved yet? The only possible answer is that there is something preventing it, and that something cannot be in the political framework, so it must be where the political framework refuses to look, in the apolitical network of social relations from the market to the family. That's where actual freedom resides. The change required is not political reform, but a transformation of the social relations of production. This entails precisely revolutionary class struggle rather than democratic elections or any other political measure in the narrow sense of the term. The narrow sense of the political is, for example, voting. But we do not vote on who owns what, or about, relations in the factory, because as Zizek says, such matters remain outside the sphere of the political. And it is illusory to expect that we can effectively change things by extending democracy into the economic sphere. Zizek's point is that the political sphere, in its narrow sense, is defined by rules, by laws, which are made to protect the economic and social structure as it is. They are not tools to change those structures. They are part of the bourgeois apparatus, and therefore they will always circle back in maintaining that apparatus. That's why radical changes need to be made outside the sphere of legal rights. In democratic procedures, solutions are sought solely through those democratic mechanisms that themselves are parts of that apparatus that guarantees the undistributed reproduction of capital a priori. From the start, the capitalist knows most of capital will not be distributed. And so in this sense, it is in this sense that democracy is a fetish for Zizek. He borrows the expression from French Marxist Alain Badiou, who said that today people always resort to democracy to solve all kinds of problems, but that only blinds them to the structural nature of their problems. That's a fetish. It's not just something sacred, it's like a coping mechanism to avoid facing the fractured nature of reality expressed in that apparatus. It avoids us having to face the trauma of social antagonism, that is, the Lacanian real. Don't forget, Zizek uses Lacan a lot, so words like lag, the real, etc. So in short, democracy becomes the last thing we see before confronting the lack, constitutive of our social life. The fact that there is no class relationship, in the same way that Lacan said that love is a fetish, to confront us in the realization that there is no sexual relationship. It is something we add to cover that empty space, that lack, When confronted with the reality of domination and exploitation that are at the basis of our social organization, when we see the brutal social struggles, we can always add, we can say, yes, things are bad, but we have democracy, which gives us hope of resolving, or at least regulating struggles, preventing their destructive outcomes. So this is the democratic illusion, the acceptance of democratic mechanisms as providing the only framework for any possible change. But that same illusion prevails and it prevents the radical transformation of society. And this leads us to the second criticism, and that is Stiglitz's idea that there are two capitalisms, one good that is supposed to work and one bad that went rogue. But we can go back to that good capitalism through elections. We know it's possible because there was a time of this good version of capitalism. Again, this is the 70s, that time everyone wants to go back to. So let's remember it again. In the 70s, there was a moment where profits suddenly fell. Again, this is supposed to happen with the growth and the welfare state that so many talk about. We are supposed to make profits because that is money that you put in public services and infrastructures, in wages, etc. But what happened when those profits fell in the 70s? Well, no one was happy about it. It was panic on board, and the whole system entered a crisis, unemployment rose, and the government couldn't get any CEO to hire people. You cannot force the state to do shit. Elections need to take place on a local level, but like Piketty already knew, the model he proposed would only work if enforced globally, beyond the confines of nation states. Otherwise, capital would flee to the states with lower taxes. So, given the impossibility to take global measures, the only way to save capitalism was, you guessed it, neoliberalism. Various regulations were quickly discarded and taxes were, lowered right away. If we do the same thing now, if we put back regulations at the same level as they were back then, or even at a higher level, wouldn't capitalism just collapse again? And so these greedy capitalisms were right to oppose regulations and governments. Governments, they were aware of it. They knew it. They knew this. They know that they cannot put too much restrictions and regulations. So whenever they call for regulations through elections, if at the end what was elected were, demands for higher regulations, governments won't pass them. When you are in capitalism, and if you want to remain in capitalism, you cannot be anything else but neoliberal. And like Saito says about capitalism, in any case, it would never accept this sort of restriction on its functioning. It would oppose it at every turn. Capitalists have the power to exert enormous amounts of political pressure, not just by threatening to move factories overseas, but to sell government bonds and cause stock prices to fall precipitously. So, for capitalists to possess those assets, it's only natural. By essence, a capitalist has the power to usher such threats, no matter which period we are in. Capitalists always have the power to move factories overseas or cause stock prices to fall. That's why governments are always helpless against capitalists and end up working with them and for their interests. In capitalism, it's precisely capitalists that hold power. So Stiglitz is completely wrong. His argument is based on the new true Scotsman fallacy. That's when, a general claim is challenged by a counterexample instead of accepting that the general claim might be false or needs refinement. The person, refines the group in a way that excludes the counterexample, often without justification. For example, I say, no Scotsman puts sugar on his, porridge. And you respond with a counterexample and say, but my friend Angus is Scottish and he puts sugar on his porridge. And so I answer with, well, no true Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge. Your friend isn't a true Scotsman. So that is the fallacy. And Stiglitz uses a similar fallacy regarding capitalism. There's true capitalism, and there's the capitalism that we are in now, this phony capitalism, which Stiglitz calls ersatz capitalism. And we need to go back to true capitalism, the golden age of capitalism from the end of World War II until the 1970s. But as Zizek and Saito respond that capitalism, which he so longs to return, was in fact the aberration, the phony version of capitalism. That would mean the present phony system that Stiglitz so abhors is in fact capitalism's true face. In this sense, the reforms Stiglitz calls for are incompatible with the continued workings of capitalism, and for that reason they can never actually be realized. Doesn't this make Stiglitz, who passionately argues that these reforms are exactly what will sustain capitalism into the future, the one chasing dreams of an impossible return to the past? So that's Zizek's main point, that such a solution is utopian in the strictest sense of the term. It is pretty ironic since utopian is now used against Marxists, but in reality, those who are utopian are the ones who think they can make capitalism work. Those who want a return to the past are those who want capitalism to be something else than what it is. And the greatest irony of all is when Stiglitz says that capitalist markets do not exist in a vacuum, but doesn't see that the political process of democracy that he champions to solve all of the shit also doesn't exist in a vacuum, but is always overdetermined by economic relations. Now, we need to clarify something, that Saito isn't calling for a return to the Soviet Union. We've already said that the Soviet Union's Marxism was the same brand of Marxism criticized by Chomsky in Poland, the Promethean one, which is a disaster for the environment, and I will explain that next week. So a return to Soviet-style arrangement is out of question. But the question remains, if all options are inefficient, if green capitalism/growth cannot work, and if growth without capitalism is as infeasible as capitalism without growth, then what is left? For Saito, the only thing possible is a new theory of degrowth that challenges capitalism in itself, while also stating that any attempt to blend degrowth with capitalism or with non- or anti-communism is doomed to fail. Like he rhetorically suggested regarding Stiglitz, those who live in fantasies, who are completely idealistic and don't have any sense of reality, well, are capitalists, those who call for a reform of capitalism. Whomever calls for measures to tame capitalism doesn't understand even the definition of capitalism. So the critics of the degrowth theorists are right to point that out, at least, that capitalism's own definitions excludes degrowth. Capitalism's very definition precludes any possible pairing with degrowth. Capital is defined by an endless movement to increase value. Investment is repeated again and again while the production of goods and services creates new value, raising profits and continuously expanding. The only way it can realize its goals is to use all the world's resources and labor power, operating new markets and never passing up even the smallest chance to make more money. So the very premise of capitalism entails endless growth. Like we said, capitalism is always forced to look for value. It is forced to constantly produce goods and services. And so this means that it cannot just be content with specific goods and services, those that respond to human needs or serve social utility especially. By constant, it means that it has to keep producing even if we've had enough, even if our needs are met. If you want to force capitalism into just satisfying our genuine needs, then you are telling capitalism not to seek profits, but then it won't be capitalism. The older generation of degrowth theorists argue for a carefree form of degrowth capitalism, meaning that they need the market to contract to a level that is sustainable, that capitalism stops externalizing its contradictions and transferring the costs of, to the periphery. Otherwise, what's the point of the welfare state and policies if externalization continues? So they insist that it must stop its plunder of natural resources, it must stop prioritizing corporate profits and instead place our emphasis on enhancing the happiness of workers and consumers. But according to Saito, if we succeed in all of this, then what is left to be called capitalism? it is like you take away from something everything that it does and still call it that thing. Like imagine someone telling you we can have colonization but without territorial conquest, cultural dominance, resource extraction, forced labor, and the imposition of foreign governance. Like those things are what constitute colonialism's very essence. If those don't exist, then there is no colonialism anymore. And like Kōhei Saitō says, profit-making, market expansion, externalization, displacement, and the extraction of human labor and natural resources are what constitutes capitalism's very essence. To demand the cessation of these things, to demand deceleration, is in fact to demand capitalism's end. And yet, the theorists of degrowth are specifically asking to take away the things that constitute capitalism and still want to call it capitalism. Well, at that point, why not just call it, why not just go for communism at that point? You cannot take away profit-making from capitalism. It is predicated on the idea of constantly looking for profits. And as such, since it always looks for market opportunities, both in space and time, it is then obligated to put a burden on the environment and on labor power that exceeds their limits. Like Saito says, the urge to grow in order to maximize profits is capitalism's most fundamental characteristic. To believe that you can do away with that while conserving capitalism is like trying to draw a round triangle. So not only you cannot stop capitalism from expanding, but you also cannot even stop it from plundering the resources, causing the destruction of both the natural world and humans' quality of life. So there is there's nothing else to do besides a new theory of degrowth, an anti- or post-capitalist form of degrowth to put brakes on capital and decelerate its movements. And we can see another example of the degrowth capitalism's limits, again with Japan. There was a period in Japan's modern history that is known as the lost decades. And this is a period of economic stagnation and deflation in Japan that began in the early 1990s, and it persisted through the 2000s, and arguably even beyond. And so this started after the burst of the bubble economy in 1991. In the late 1980s, Japan experienced a massive speculation bubble in both real estate and stock markets, fueled by low interest rates and excessive lending. So a speculative bubble is an economic phenomenon where the price of an asset, like real estate, stocks, or cryptocurrency, rises rapidly and irrationally far beyond its actual value, because people believe that they can sell it at an even higher price later. And so prices are driven not by the asset's real value, its earnings or usefulness, but by hype, by FOMO, fear of missing out, and crowd behavior, like the hype around crypto and Bitcoin. The price or value or something suddenly goes up, and people get all excited and want to possess it because they believe that its value will keep increasing, and so they will sell it at a higher price later. All right, and so this is why it is a speculation. Buyers aren't investing for long-term value; they are betting or speculating that prices will keep rising and that they can flip the asset for profit. It's like the hot potato game where someone gets a ball and has to pass it to someone else, who passes it to someone else, etc., like in a circle, while a music plays, and when the music stops, the person holding the ball is eliminated, and the last person who gets out is the winner. So here's it's the same concept here. Everyone knows the price is absurd, but as long as they can sell it to the next person for more, the game continues. When no one wants to buy anymore, well, the bubble bursts. So it's yeah, it's very unsustainable. The rapid rise in prices creates a feedback loop. Rising prices attract more buyers who think that if something is that expensive, then it must be very good, which pushes prices even higher. But eventually, reality catches up. When confidence breaks, often suddenly people rush to sell, causing prices to plummet, and many are left with huge losses. And that's exactly what happened in Japan in 1991, and that had a detrimental effect on Japan's growth. The Bank of Japan raised interest rates to cool down speculation, which caused both real estate and stock markets to crash. Many companies and banks were left with bad loans. Banks, became reluctant to lend, which shocked economic activity. And in that period of the lost decades, Saito says that we can see firsthand a degrowth occurring while capitalist growth imperatives still operated. So the bubble makes profit rates go down, which normally means less human activity, so normally less CO2. So the bursted bubble, not the bubble itself. Okay, so the bursted bubble makes profit rates go down. So if profit rates go down, it means less human activity, which means less CO2. So this should rejoice degrowth theorists. Saito even mentions an Oxford professor, Danny Dorling's book, also titled Slow Down, but in one word. So the full title is Slow Down, the End of the Great Acceleration and Why It's Good for the Planet, the Economy and Our Lives. So in that book, Dorling argues that what is happening in Japan is a good thing because it will force the economy to look for an alternative economy based on notions of the good life instead of growth. It must be a lesson to learn that growth cannot be, sought endlessly because there is always a bubble to burst. So Dorling, Dorling explicitly presents Japan as a pioneer of socioeconomic slowdown, to be at the forefront of slowdown, as he says. He identifies it as a society where population, consumption, construction, and urban growth have all plateaued or declined, especially since the early 1990s. Like things no longer need to grow. This is not exactly framed in the language of degrowth, but it is functionally very close. What Dorling describes in the book is stabilization or contraction in economic and demographic indicators, while Japan remains a highly developed capitalist society. So Japanese people are increasingly seeking slower, more balanced lives, with examples of urban to rural migration to alternative lifestyles and decreased consumption. You have growing stories of couples who moved from Osaka to Shimanto, which is a rural town, for a quieter life. He says that the new impetus in Japan is to move to the countryside springs and imagining a better work-life balance, finding cheaper housing and escaping, the rat race. And slowing down gives us, time to reflect and time to change what really matters. It gives us, time itself. This is how Dorling puts it. So he presents the post-1991 Japan as a capitalist society experiencing a long-term slowdown, moving towards stability rather than expansion, and increasingly choosing alternative, slower, and potentially more sustainable lifestyles. But as you can guess, things are more complicated than what they seem on the surface. When capitalists see that growth is stalling, they immediately see their profit rates go down, and so instead of being like, okay, this must be a good thing for the climate, we will just, keep slowing things down, well, they will do everything in their power to bring those rates up again or slow their decline as much as they can. Capitalists enter a zero-sum game, and now everything goes to cut costs. Workers' wages go down while permanent jobs are restructured and eliminated, which widens the class divide at home while exploitation only intensifies in the global south. capitalists go look for cheap labor in order to compensate for their lost rates. And of course, the labor is cheap because governments there too don't offer labor rights protections and are not strong enough, and they are corrupt enough to welcome these companies and let them do anything with their population as long as they get a piece of the pie. And back home, the same happens as black market companies, buraku kigyo in Japanese, since they avoid all regulations, they can put young workers through inhumane conditions, leading many to suicide and burnouts. And since that labor was cheap, then again, we see those curves going down from the graph. The share of income crumbles, meaning that less wealth is going to labor, and so inequalities between the poor and the rich rise. Like Saito says, as the pie gets smaller and stable employment becomes scarce, people compete even more fiercely with each other for survival. In Japan, the recent popularization of referring to people as high-class/low-class citizens indicates how deeply the social divide has been inscribed into people's hearts. And if you think the government is going to prevent them, as long as it doesn't take down capitalism, which of course they won't, then it will have to deal with the growing rates of unemployment. As long as you are in capitalism, understand that your hands will always be tied to blackmail. Now, fair enough, all degrowth theorists can respond by saying that these instances don't represent what they mean by degrowth. Japan's long-term stagnation or the global recession caused by COVID-19 aren't steady-state or degrowth economies. They can argue that these were unplanned and chaotic events, whereas the degrowth capitalism they have in mind won't cause to put people in those dire situations because it would be controlled, right? Of course, if degrowth simply means a decrease of the GDP, then periods of wars can also be considered degrowth policy. When the climate crisis turns the Earth into an apocalyptic desert, that would be degrowth too at this point. So, of course, a successful degrowth policy doesn't only look at decreased GDP, but also at sustaining people at decent and fulfilling standards of living. This also is important to flush out general misconceptions about degrowth, even the one Saito advocates for. Degrowth isn't just the GDP going down. The point of degrowth is also to say that the GDP should never be a figure to look at when evaluating a nation's success, let alone the only one by which we measure that success. However, Saito's point is that if you don't want the GDP to be the only thing you look at or a relevant factor to be concerned with, then you cannot support capitalism. Capitalism will always prioritize GDP and will only consider other factors as important once it has the guarantee that the GDP is still growing. So Saito agrees that we need to make people indifferent to GDP and not be afraid when they hear the word degrowth. I tell you about degrowth and you go like, what about the GDP? No, that indicator should be eradicated for good. But you cannot do that in capitalism. So while he rejects the degrowth capitalist theorists, showing how absurd their plan is, he also wants people to stop caring about the GDP and stop being afraid from the word degrowth. Degrowth is good, actually. Not giving a fuck about the GDP is good. It's the only way and the only first step towards a steady-state economy, okay? So we also need to be released from the myth that it is only through the GDP that we can be happy and have prosperity. Yes, every time the GDP goes down, it got worse for everyone and even the planet, because capitalists just become crazy and exploit resources even more to bring that motherfucker back up. But that's all because we are witnessing GDP drops in a capitalist systems. In systems where we already all believe that there is no other social structure and political organization that can make us prosperous, never having to worry about food, water, shelter, health, community, political voice, etc. Chomsky was right in calling, the market fundamentalists religious. They worship the GDP. For them, without GDP, everybody will kill everybody, just like, the church believe that without God, we will all murder each other. And the sort of fear leads to still accept the dogma, even though the prosperity promised for everyone never comes. I swear, at this point, people having faith in faith that capitalism will bring prosperity for everyone is like, waiting for the second coming at this point. Like Saito says, in truth, the GDP is an extremely superficial indicator developed around 100 years ago and one that has enormous statistical limitations. Given how much we've progressed since then, why are we still allowing ourselves to be manipulated by this crude measure? So let's understand what degrowth is really. Degrowth, first of all, is not capitalism. It cannot be. If it's capitalism, then you cannot make GDP secondary or completely irrelevant. That's what the old generation of degrowth theorists struggle to understand. And even more radically, degrowth isn't just not capitalism, but it is capitalism's antithesis. Saito says, as capitalism's antithesis, degrowth emphasizes forms of prosperity and quality of life that aren't necessarily reflected in the GDP. Degrowth is a transition from quantity, growth, to quality, flourishing. It's a grand plan to transform the economy to a model that prioritizes the shrinking of the economic gap, the expansion of social security, and the maximization of free time, all while respecting planetary boundaries. So that's what it is about. For human beings, it means shrinking the economic gap, so no economic inequalities, expansion of social security, like free access to healthcare, maximizing free time, meaning that people don't have to work more than they actually do or that they actually need, and can enjoy their free time doing leisure activities. And as for nature, no planetary boundary or ecological ceiling has to be overshot. This is the difference between growth and degrowth in Saito's sense. In growth, you will always have fossil fuel consumption, so don't even try the energy transition. So no respect for ecological ceiling is possible in growth. With growth, you will always have a widening of the economic gap, which widens more rapidly when growth stalls. If you see growth stalling while the gap widens and at higher speed, understand that no degrowth is taking place. We are still in capitalism. In capitalism, if production shrinks, you won't have maximization of free time but unemployment. And when growth stalls, it is always the activities that are humanely needed that are cut in order to keep the ones we don't need productive and competitive. Meaning you see cuts in fundings for education, social security, and the arts to save the production of SUVs and beef and fast fashion consumption. So it is very important that we don't confuse degrowth with capitalism's long-term stagnation, like first generation of degrowth theorists do. Hiroi is then completely wrong to try to make the last decades a period of degrowth policy or claim that Japan is in a leadership position regarding degrowth. So let's sum up again. Saito's degrowth aims at bringing equality and sustainability, like equality among people, and in a way that doesn't cause any metabolic rift, in a harmonious way with nature, that's sustainability. By contrast, when capitalism is stagnating, when the GDP goes down in capitalism, we have none of that. Instead, we have inequality and want, which then leads to intensified competition between individuals on the one hand and companies on the other, which accelerates the metabolic rift. Companies plunder resources faster while individuals start adopting all kinds of survival strategies with less concern for the environment, like for example get involved in exotic endangered animal illegal trade. Capitalism has turned society in which human beings are supposed to care and help each other, it turned mutual aid into a dog-eat-dog world. Even at times of prosperity, The meritocratic ethos pushes us to always view each other with distrust, thus preparing us for a war against all, when things go bad. In today's society, which exposes everyone to relentless competition, no one has the luxury to extend a hand to those less fortunate. If you become homeless, you can even find yourself turned away from an evacuation center during a hurricane. In a dog-eat-dog society wherein a lack of money can lead to the deprivation of basic human rights and even threats to one's life, mutual aid becomes nearly impossible. So, for those reasons, Saito says that the climate crisis cannot be dealt on its own, separate from other issues, and this is what degrowth pushes us to do. Climate change requires ending capitalism by bringing about an ethos of equality and mutual aid. There is no climate justice without social justice. Hence, we need to consider race, class, gender, money and markets all together. And thus, approaches require that degrowth be not a matter of laws or policies only. Like I said, what will put a stop to climate change is not a top-down solutions, but direct actions. Institutions, governments, laws, and policies have all proven to be inefficient for a transition to a steady-state economy, as they always try to make, compromises with capital. To prioritize sustainability and the redistribution of resources requires direct action from citizens, and also that these measures aim at putting an end to capitalism. Most theorists we mentioned don't dare to go that far. They stop at overthrowing capitalism. Raworth doesn't include production, market, and class as fundamental issues in her key factors to get to this donut economy, for example. In the section, Can We Live Within the Doughnut of the first chapter of her book, she just lists population, distribution, technology, aspiration, and governments, but she leaves aside the sectors that are at the heart of capitalism. Population means simply population control. To be able to live within the donut, we need the right amount of people. The more we are, the more resources it takes to meet the needs and rights of all. But to contain the size of the population, what Raworth argues, what we need is neither famine, disease, nor war, but success. What allows families to be less crowded, for example, was that women are now freer, more independent, educated, they have productive rights and empowerment. Distribution then means the efficient distribution of resources, especially food. She argues that only 3% of the global food supply, if redistributed equally, would take the 13% of people starving in the world out of starvation, instead of wasting that food in post-harvest global supply chains or, scrapped off dinner plates and into kitchen bins. And to end the world hunger, we just need, 10% of the food that never gets eaten. Then you have the third factor, the third aspiration. Whatever people consider necessarily for a good life. She links this to how and where we live. Like right now, almost half people in the world live in cities or towns, and we are likely to be 70% living in urban areas by 2050. And so this plays a huge role on our lifestyle, which is mostly consumerist. We have thousands of billboards trying to get us to buy, things that we are promised will give us happiness, but these goods and services come at a price. The excessive consumption and demand for them will have clear ramifications for our collective pressure on planetary boundaries. And so this leads us to the fourth factor, technology. Our technologies will reflect our choices in our lifestyle. Technologies can either reflect our choices of wanting to live within planetary boundaries or overshoot them. And the last factor, governance, also plays a role of whether we get to live, inside the donut. We must, design governance that is suited to the challenges we face, a governance that can reduce humans' pressure on planetary boundaries in ways that are equitable, meaning they take into account complex interactions, such as, the inextricable linkage between the food, water, and energy sectors, for example. So all of these are important, but what strikes Saito is that none of them actually challenges the capitalist mode of production, but simply tiptoes around it. Instead, we need to fight it head-on, otherwise all of this talk about sustainability is just talk. The role that private property, for example, plays in obstructing sustainability cannot be omitted. If we do, then we are just admitting defeat. We capitulated to the power of capital and accepted that we will always live in inequality and lack of freedom. And thus we are trapped again in fantasies. We dream of sci-fi futures, whether a future with nets that will save us, or dream of somehow, we can have those things we long for, but always within capitalism, if not, dreams of, colonizing Mars or something like that. So degrowth capitalism is nothing but another fantasy. This is what must be accepted, that it is a fantasy. What isn't a fantasy is degrowth in a post-capitalist society. That's the fourth scenario, the future X, the unknown future, but it can become known, it can become visible in the horizon if we dare to go back to the theories of men. Capitalism has to a man that capitalism has lobbied senselessly to make us forget. So these are the theories that put back-class struggle in the center of the climate change, the climate issue, and insist that no climate justice is possible as long as class divides of exploitation and domination are not overcome, and that labor hasn't been revolutionized yet. And yes, you guessed it, it's time to resurrect Karl Marx. And first, to dig up Marx from his grave means that we become mature enough to take history seriously. History offers us, enough proof that mature capitalism will never accept low or no growth and will never naturally transition to a steady-state economy. Holding on to such beliefs makes us no different from someone who is in an abusive relationship. But instead of leaving, they stick around holding on to the idea that they will change one day. So what does history tell us about the trajectory of capitalism? Well, it always follows the same path. In a capitalist setting, when a period of low growth is on the horizon, which always happens in capitalisms every 10 years or so, capitalism becomes even more ruthless than it usually is. It intensifies its violence and turns into fascism. In the case of a climate crisis, it will intensify its ecological imperialism and resort to climate fascism to maintain, the imperial mode of living for the small rich minority. Simultaneously, disaster capitalism will try to defend these disasters to turn these disasters into business opportunities, taking advantage of the deadly chaos of the climate crisis. So the consequences will be irreversible and beyond what human hands can fix. And so here, it's everyone for themselves. Civil wars will erupt, and the masses will eventually overthrow the fascist authorities, but they won't organize to bring a socialist political organization. No, they will just keep fighting each other, exactly like a post-apocalyptic movie where human beings have descended to a Hobbesian state of nature. From climate fascism, we find ourselves in extreme barbarism. So a slow growth in a capitalist setting is truly the worst thing ever, and we must avoid these scenarios. But of course, a slow growth is always going to happen. Even if we find the formula to make capitalism grow exponentially without crashing, that formula will only be an abstract mathematical formula. In reality, capitalism's growth relies on the existing physical resources, which are finite. Once it runs out of resources to exploit, the slowing of the economy will be inevitable. When that happens, the fascist and barbarian scenarios that we thought won't happen because we crack the code, they will happen. So we need to act now. What we need is to leave the Anthropocene, not through disaster, but through a revolution in the Marxist sense, a revolution based on praxis, a practice that is planned, rational, organized, not just spontaneous. In other words, we need theory. In Marxism, theory and practice, they are never separate, but inform one another in a dialectical interaction. Theory then isn't an interpretation of the word, but a plan to put it in practice. It explains, yes, it explains the current system, its mechanisms, the nature of its metabolic reactions with the natural world and human beings, but in the perspective of putting an end to it. So theory, Saito writes, is willing to criticize capitalism in plain terms while demanding the active transition to a degrowth society equally plainly. There is no time left to waste on half measures or policies that would defer action to some future date. The degrowth theory of the new generation must incorporate a much more radical critique of capitalism to work. Yes, I am talking about communism. Hence the necessity of bringing degrowth together with the writings of Karl Marx. Now, Saito anticipates concerns from readers. Marx is a dangerous name, like Voldemort for liberals and capitalists. His name strikes perhaps more fear in the heart of people today than degrowth. So imagine if you try to combine them both. Imagine the panic when you say, I am going to use Marx for a theory of degrowth. Some reasons for the skepticism is the belief that Marxism, communism, is like capitalism in that it should be vulnerable to the same criticism that we directed towards capitalism. If we said that capitalism is incompatible with ecology and degrowth, well, can't we say the same about Marxism? There are many who believe that Marxism as a theory of class conflict has nothing to contribute to a conversation about the environment. Plus, they like to point out to Marx's Prometheanism, and that the Soviet Union was so preoccupied with economic growth too that it did significant amounts of environmental damage. So Marxism should be as bad as capitalism for a partner of ecology and degrowth. Combining Marxism and degrowth would be like trying to mix oil and water, right? Well, about the ecological part, we'll see next week that it's not really the case, and so it is next week that we will talk about Marx's eco-socialism. So we're going to dive into Saito's book, Marx's eco-socialism, but we're not going to read from it. I'll just explain by summarizing each chapter, because the next chapter in Slow Down is about why Marx came to embrace degrowth communism, and it is necessary that we understand his progression, like how he moved from this Promethean philosophy, this productivism, how he moved from that to eco-socialism, and then from eco-socialism how he moved to degrowth communism. So Marx's eco-socialism is going to be very important for us here. So next week, we are not going to read a chapter from Degrowth, from Slow Down by Kōhei Saitō, but we are going to explain chapter by chapter Saito's first book, Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism. So that's it for today. I hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope that you found it very interesting. And as always, subscribe, leave a comment,